He shoved her in the chest. Not with words, not with legal papers. With his actual hand-flat palm, full force, and Tamsin Aldridge stumbled backward into the mud while the whole town watched and said nothing. Garrick Vane stood on her porch. Her porch, the one her husband had built plank by plank before the fever took him. And he smiled the way men smile when they already know they've won. "You've got until the snow falls," he said. "After that, whatever's left inside becomes mine." Her mother, Brenna, was standing behind her, 70 years old, shaking not from cold, but from the kind of fear that settles into old bones and doesn't leave easily. If that had happened to you, if they threw you and your mother out into the first freeze of winter with almost nothing, what would you have done? Before we go any further, if stories like this one make you feel something, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. Every week we bring you stories of ordinary people who found extraordinary strength when the world turned its back on them. Drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you make it to the end of this one, hit that like button. It genuinely helps more than you know now. Let's go back to the beginning. Tamsin Aldridge had never been the kind of woman people looked at and immediately thought, she'll be fine. She was 26 years old, and she was very heavy noticeably, undeniably so, in a way that people in Redwillow Crossing felt entitled to have opinions about. The frontier settlement sat at the edge of what most civilized maps hadn't bothered to name yet, a cluster of rough-hewn cabins and mud roads carved out of wilderness by people too stubborn or too desperate to stay where they came from. Life out there didn't reward softness. Everyone understood that, and somehow, without anyone officially declaring it, the community had quietly decided that Tamsin represented a kind of softness they couldn't afford. It wasn't fair. It wasn't accurate either. But fairness and accuracy were luxuries Redwillow Crossing rarely offered. Her husband, Callan, had understood her differently. He was a quiet man, methodical in everything he did, the kind of person who read the sky every morning the way other people read scripture. He taught Tamsin how to identify which clouds meant rain within 6 hours and which meant 3 days. He showed her how to tell good soil from dead soil by the smell and the weight of it in your palm. He explained which wild plants healed infection, which prevented it, which would make you sicker than whatever you already had. The land talks, he used to say, kneeling beside a patch of ground and pressing his fingers into it like he was taking a pulse. You just have to learn its language. Tamsin had learned it well, eventually better than Callan himself, though she never said so out loud because she loved him and he was already a modest man who didn't need to be made to feel smaller. Then the fever came through in late summer, and it took him in 11 days. She had done everything she knew how to do, made the poultices, kept the fever from climbing past a certain point. Twice she pulled him back from the edge and genuinely believed she was winning. The third time she couldn't. She held his hand while the morning light came through the window, and she stayed there for a long time after, unable to move, unable to think past the immediate, terrible fact of his absence. After the burial, she planted the winter crops he had planned. She tended them with the same attention he'd modeled for her. She kept the deep well clean, maintained the irrigation channels that fed not just her property, but 3 neighboring plots downstream. And for a while, things were simply difficult. Manageable difficult. The kind of hard that widows in frontier settlements faced and usually survived. Then the harvest failed. Not just on Tamsin's land. Everywhere. A combination of early frost and a soil fungus nobody had seen before spread through the fields like a slow catastrophe, wiping out reserves before anyone fully understood the scale of what was happening. By mid-autumn, Redwillow Crossing was looking at a winter with maybe 60% of the food supply it needed. People were scared. And when people are scared in tight communities, they look for something to blame. They look for whoever seems most different, most suspicious, most easily made into the explanation for something that has no good explanation. Garrick Vane had been watching Tamsin's land for months before the harvest failed. He was the largest landholder in the settlement, wealthy by frontier standards, which meant he owned more than others and owed fewer favors. He had a way of standing in conversation that suggested he was always slightly more comfortable than you were, always slightly more certain of how things were going to go. He had come to her twice with what he called offers for her property. The first time, The week after Callan's burial, she had thanked him politely and declined. The second time, a month later, the offer was lower, as if grief had devalued the land along with everything else. Declined again, less politely. The third visit wasn't an offer. Garrick started small. A comment at the weekly community, gathering just a passing observation, really that it was unusual how the fungus seemed to have started closest to Tamsin's property. Nothing accusatory, just an observation. He was simply saying what some people had been noticing. He wasn't suggesting anything. He didn't have to suggest anything. The seed was planted. A woman named Doris Prether started asking, at a gathering 3 days later, whether anyone had considered that Tamsin spent a lot of time alone out in the fields, at night sometimes, and that she had all those plants, all those roots and leaves and dried things hanging in her window. Didn't Callan always say she knew things about plants that even he couldn't explain? Wasn't that a little strange? Tamsin had been in the room when Doris said it. She had looked directly at Doris, a woman she had sat beside at dozens of community dinners, a woman whose youngest child she had helped treat for a chest cough 2 winters prior, and Doris had looked away. That was the moment Tamsin understood what was happening. Not a misunderstanding, not a rumor spiraling out of hand. This was constructed, deliberate. Someone was building something, and they were using her as the foundation stone. She went to Elowin. Elowin Marr was the closest thing Tamsin had to a friend in Redwillow Crossing. They had known each other since both their families arrived within the same season, years back. Elowin's was sharp, funny in the dry way of someone who had seen enough disappointment to stop expecting otherwise, and she had a way of saying what she actually thought that Tamsin had always valued. They had talked through Callan's illness together. Elowin's had sat with Brenna on the bad nights. "You see what they're doing," Tamsin said. It wasn't a question. Elowin looked uncomfortable. She was standing in her own doorway, and she hadn't fully opened the door. "Tamsin, I'm not asking you to do anything," Tamsin said. "I'm just asking if you see it." A long pause. "I see it," Elowin said quietly. "Then you know it's going to get worse." Elowin didn't answer that, and Tamsin understood, in the silence that followed, that Elowin was going to stay quiet. Not because she was cruel, because she was afraid, and because her fear was bigger than her friendship. People have limits. Tamsin had always known that, even if she had hoped, privately, that Elowin's limits were wider than most. She walked home in the dark and sat beside her mother and didn't say anything for a long time. "Bad?" Brenna asked. "Getting there," Tamsin said. Brenna was not a woman who dealt in false comfort. She had lived too long for that. She reached over and squeezed Tamsin's hand once, hard, and then let go, and picked up the mending she'd been working on. "Then we prepare," Brenna said. They started quietly that same night. Tamsin began pulling together what she could, without it being noticeable, dried medicinal herbs, wrapped tightly and tucked into the bottoms of storage containers. Extra needles and thread. The smallest, sharpest tools from Callan's workbench. She kept her movements calm, her expression unchanged at the weekly gatherings, even as the accusations became less subtle, and the looks from neighbors became harder to mistake for anything innocent. Garrick spoke at the next gathering. He was formal about it, almost apologetic in his tone, which was somehow worse than if he'd simply been cruel. He talked about the community's responsibility to each other, about how in hard times certain difficult decisions had to be made for the greater safety of everyone, about how it pained him deeply, deeply to raise concerns about a neighbor, especially one who had suffered the loss of a beloved husband. He let the pause after beloved husband sit there just long enough. Then he laid out his case. Tamsin's knowledge of plants and soil, her solitary habits, the proximity of her land to where the fungus first appeared, the fact that she had declined twice to sell property that would benefit the whole community. "I'm not calling her a witch," he said carefully. "I want to be very clear about that. I'm simply saying that in times like these, when we've lost so much and winter is coming, the community has to ask certain questions for the safety of our children. The safety of our children." Tamsin had seen it deployed before that phrase, or something like it. It ended discussions. It was a lock with no key. She stood up. Several people looked startled, as if they hadn't expected her to respond directly. "My husband taught me everything I know about this land," she said. Her voice was steady. She had practiced steady. "The same plants I've used to treat your sick children. Doris, I sat with your boy for 2 nights when he couldn't breathe. You were there. You watched me work. Doris stared at the table. I haven't done anything to this harvest. The fungus comes from wet soil and cold nights. That's a fact, not a suspicion, and anyone who's worked soil long enough knows it. She looked at Garrick. What's actually happening here is that someone wants my land and my well, and he's found a way to make you afraid enough to hand them to him. The room was very quiet. Then Marcus Prether Doris's husband, broader across the shoulders than most men in the room, said, without looking at her, "Sit down, woman." She didn't sit down. But she also understood in that moment that she had lost. Not because she was wrong. Because it didn't matter that she was right. The vote came a week later. A community decision, they called it. Formal, almost gentle in its language. For the safety of the settlement, in light of community concerns, Tamsin Aldridge and her dependent mother, Brinna, were to relocate beyond the settlement boundary before the first snowfall. Her property would be held in trust, Garrick's word for community benefit. Elwyn did not vote against it. She didn't vote for it either. She simply sat there, her hands folded in her lap, and said nothing, while her silence became its own kind of answer. The morning they left, the sky was the color of an old bruised deep blue-gray at the horizon, fading to something pale and exhausted overhead. The first frost had already whitened the grass. Tamsin had packed what she could carry, which wasn't much. Her own body made carrying things a different kind of calculation from what it was for other people. Everything had weight and distance attached to it, and she'd had to think carefully about what was worth the cost. Brinna carried nothing. Tamsin had insisted on that. Garrick was there when they came out of the house. He didn't need to be there. He had chosen to be there. He was standing on the porch, her porch, already acting like it belonged to him, with 2 other men flanking him, and his expression carried the particular satisfaction of someone who had planned something for a long time and watched it finally come together. "Safe travels," he said. There was absolutely nothing sincere about it. Tamsin looked at him for a long moment. She had told herself she wouldn't say anything, that anything she said would be something he enjoyed, one more small victory over her. But she was standing in front of her own home with her 70-year-old mother behind her and a winter ahead of them that people in much better condition than either of them didn't survive. And she said, "You think you've solved a problem. You've created one." Garrick tilted his head. "Is that a threat?" "It's arithmetic," she said. "You've driven away the person in this settlement who understands plants, soil, water, and medicine better than anyone else alive in it. You'll feel that before spring. I promise you." She didn't wait for a response. She turned and put her hand on her mother's back, and they walked away from the only home Tamsin had made as an adult, into a morning that smelled like ice and pine, and the particular kind of emptiness that comes when you understand that no one is coming to help you. The crowd that had gathered to watch them go said nothing. Somewhere behind her, she heard Garrick step back into the house and close the door. The first mile was the longest of her life. Her knees had always given her trouble when the cold set in not a secret, not something she was ashamed of, simply a fact about her body that required acknowledgement. By the second mile they were throbbing steadily, in a way that her jaw muscles tightened against. She set a pace that was slower than she wanted, and faster than was comfortable, but not warming, and she had done enough reading of the sky to know that the clouds building in the northwest, were not the gentle kind. Brinna walked beside her without complaint, which cost more than it looked. Tamsin knew. Her mother was not young. Her mother was not strong. But Brinna Aldridge had a particular quality that Tamsin had inherited in full. She simply refused to perform suffering for an audience, even when the audience was no one. "How far are we going?" Brinna asked. Practical question. No panic in it. "Far enough that Vane's Reach doesn't follow us," Tamsin said. "There's higher ground northeast of here. Callan talked about it once, said there were hills. Some old forest. Better windbreak than the open prairie. You remember him mentioning that once and you're navigating by it?" "I remember him mentioning everything," Tamsin said. "It's the only thing he left me that nobody can take." Brinna was quiet for a moment. Then that and his stubbornness. "He got that from me." It wasn't funny. It was a little funny. They kept walking. By the time the light had shifted from thin white to the deep gray, that meant afternoon without warmth, the trees Callan had described she hoped had appeared on the horizon. Not many. Not a forest in the way books describe forests. Just a thickening of dark shapes ahead, pines pressing close together the way things press together against cold. Her feet were numb. She didn't tell Brenna that. The last stretch of ground between open land and tree cover crossed a marsh that had frozen in places and not in others. And crossing it meant testing each step before committing, which meant each step cost twice what it should have. Twice Tamsin's foot broke through ice into freezing mud up to her shin. Twice she hauled it back out and kept going. By the time they reached the trees, she was breathing hard in a way she didn't love, and her knees were past throbbing and into a different register of pain that she'd learned to just decide to ignore. Trees closed over them. The wind, which had been a constant pressure on their left side for hours, dropped to almost nothing. The temperature didn't change, but the quality of the cold changed. It became still, breathable, less like something attacking them, and more like something simply present. Brenna exhaled and put her hand on the nearest tree trunk. "Keep moving," Tamsin said gently. "Just a little further. We need shelter before dark." Dark was maybe 90 minutes away, maybe less. The clouds had moved in completely. She found it almost by accident. She had been moving parallel to a ridge line, trying to read the terrain the way Callan had taught her, looking for anything natural that might break wind on multiple sides, a rock formation, a depression, anything. The pines here were old, thick-trunked, their lower branches dead and dry and stretching outward close to the ground. And then she walked around a particular outcropping of rock, and the trees opened slightly, and there it was, a dark opening in the hillside. Narrow, she'd have to angle her shoulders to get through, but tall enough to stand in, and deeper than it first appeared. Ancient. The kind of entrance that looked like the hill had simply exhaled once and never closed its mouth again. In front of it, half hidden by pine needles and dead grass, was a low shape that resolved, as they got closer, into a grave. A wooden marker, weathered past readability. Someone had been here before. Someone had died here. Brenna saw it and stopped walking. Tamsin looked at the grave, then at the cave opening, then at the sky, which was doing something in the northwest that she recognized and didn't like. She looked at her mother. "Come on," she said. "Someone died here, Tamsin." "Somebody dies everywhere on this frontier," Tamsin said. "The difference is whether there's shelter nearby when it happens." She held out her hand. "Come on." Brenna took her hand. They walked into the dark together. The cold inside the cave was different from the cold outside. Outside was aggressive, moving, something you fought. Inside was still and heavy, like something that had been sitting there for a long time, waiting. But it was dry, drier than she'd expected. And deep her eyes adjusted slowly, and the space kept going, narrowing in places but opening again. She pressed her palm against the cave wall. Stone. Dense and cold but solid. No draft from further in, which meant it closed eventually, which meant the wind that was about to arrive outside would have very little to say in here. She stood there for a moment, in the dark, breathing. Her knees were screaming. Her feet had graduated from numb to the particular pins and needles agony that comes with returning blood flow. She was tired in a way that went past the body and into something harder to name. But she was standing inside solid stone walls with her mother alive beside her, and the storm still for now outside. She had carried them here, not because she was the fastest or the strongest, because she had remembered what Callan told her once about a hill northeast of the settlement, and she had believed it enough to walk toward it. Her knees gave her hell every step of the way. She turned to Brenna, who was standing very still with her arms wrapped around herself. "We're not going to die here," Tamsin said. Brenna looked at her in the dark. "I know," her mother said quietly. "You didn't bring me all this way to die." Outside, the first snow began to fall. The snow that started falling as they stepped into the cave didn't stop for 3 days. Tamsin knew this because she counted. Not obsessively. She wasn't the type to sit and stare at weather and calculate despair. Counted because information was the only resource she had in abundance. And she had learned from Callan that the person who stops gathering information is the person who stops making good decisions. So she tracked the snow. The temperature drops she could feel in her hands and face when she stood near the entrance, the way the wind shifted direction twice during that first long night, and what all of it told her about the kind of winter that was settling in around them. What it told her was not encouraging. The cave was dry, which remained its single greatest virtue. The floor was uneven stone, cold in a way that moved upward through your body if you sat directly on it for too long. The first night, she and Brenna huddled together against the inner wall, wrapped in the 2 blankets Tamsin had managed to pack, and did not sleep so much as exist in a state of suspended exhaustion, too cold to fully rest, too tired to stay entirely awake. Brenna's breathing worried her. Not the sound of it. Her mother breathed steadily, quietly, without the wet rattle that signaled chest problems. There was something in its shallowness that Tamsin tracked the way she tracked everything else. Brenna wasn't sick, but she was 70, and cold worked differently on old bodies. It settles in faster and left slower, and it had a way of wearing down reserves that younger people didn't think about, until those reserves were already gone. At some point before dawn, Brenna said into the dark, "I can't feel my left foot." Tamsin moved immediately. She pulled off her mother's boot. The leather was stiff, and her fingers fumbled more than she liked, and pressed both hands around the foot and held them there, steady, for a long time. Brenna made a small sound that wasn't quite pain and wasn't quite relief. "Don't rub it," Tamsin said. "Just let the heat come back slow." "I know," Brenna said. "I'm old, not ignorant." "I know you're not ignorant. I'm reminding myself." They sat like that in the dark. For 20 minutes, Tamsin holding her mother's foot between her palms while the wind outside moved around the hill and made sounds like something circling the entrance, looking for a way in. The feeling came back. Brenna pulled her foot away and worked it back into the boot herself, slowly with the particular determination of someone who refuses to need more help than is absolutely necessary. "All right," she said. "What are we going to do?" It was the right question. It was the only question, and Tamsin had been turning it over in her mind since the moment she'd walked through the cave entrance and understood that surviving the night was not the same thing as surviving the winter. "We can't just sleep in a cave," she said. "Not for months? We'd be dead before the end of January." "I agree." So we build something inside it." Brenna was quiet for a moment. "Inside the cave blocks the wind. That's the hardest thing to achieve out here, natural windbreak on all sides. But it's too cold. The floor draws heat right out of us, and we have no insulation." Tamsin shifted, working through it aloud. The way she'd learned helped her think. "But if we build walls inside real walls, with real insulation and add a heat source, we're not fighting the cold from the outside. We're creating a smaller warm space inside an already protected space. With what materials? That's what morning is for. Finding out what's within reach." Brenna didn't say it was impossible. She didn't say it was a good idea either. She said, "You sound like your husband when you talk like that." "I know. He'd have liked this problem." Tamsin felt something tighten in her chest. "Yeah," she said, "he would have." Morning revealed a landscape that looked completely different from the one they'd crossed the evening before. The snow had come down hard and soft, simultaneously, the kind that piles fast and silently, and it had turned the ground outside the cave into a continuous white surface that hid everything beneath it. The marshland she'd crossed was invisible now. The distances she'd estimated felt unreliable. But the trees were still there, old pines with lower branches thick and numerous and dry underneath the snow, which meant tinder and thin poles. The marsh, hidden under its white cover, still existed, which meant reeds. She'd glimpsed them at the edges while crossing, long and dry and densely packed, exactly the kind of material that certain northern peoples had used for insulation for centuries. She knew this because Callan had found an old trapper's manual once, water-damaged and half illegible, and they'd read it together on winter evenings when there was nothing else to do, never imagining they'd need any of it. She had also seen, about 40 yards east of the cave entrance, along the base of the ridge, an exposed section of hillside where the stone was layered differently sedimentary, she thought, which meant it might split into flat pieces if she worked it correctly. Flat stone meant a floor. A floor meant something between her mother's aging body and the cold ground that was slowly stealing heat from it. She stood at the cave entrance and made herself eat something small dried grain she'd wrapped and packed, the kind of thing that tasted like compressed regret, but had calories in it, and she looked at the landscape, and she thought, problem was her body. Not in the way Garrick Vane had used her body as an argument, as evidence of incapacity, as something that disqualified her from being taken seriously, but practically honestly, with the kind of direct accounting she'd learned to do with herself over years of navigating a world not designed for her size. Her knees had taken real punishment on the journey here. The joints were swollen. She could feel it in the way the fabric of her clothing pressed differently against them than it had the morning before. Her lower back had opinions. Her feet inside boots that fit, but were not exactly made for the kind of terrain she'd been crossing, had developed 2 blisters on her right heel that she'd noticed and decided to deal with later. She couldn't carry heavy materials over distance. That was just true, and pretending otherwise would get her killed faster than accepting it. She could drag them. She stood there another minute, working out the mechanics of it. A sled didn't require a sled. 2 long, smooth branches lashed together at one end with the other ends trailing on the ground. The snow would reduce friction enough to make it workable. She could load materials onto the middle section and drag the whole thing without lifting it off the ground at all. It wouldn't be efficient. It would be slow and exhausting and require stopping to rest more often than she wanted. But it would work. And slow and imperfect, and working was infinitely better than fast and impossible. She went back inside. "I need the longer piece of rope," she told Brenna. "And I need you to stay in here and keep the blankets on, and don't argue with me about it." "I'm going to argue about it," Brenna said. "I know. Do it while staying wrapped up." She took the rope and went back out into the snow. The first thing she cut was 2 pine branches, each roughly 8 feet long, both from the dead lower sections of trees, where the wood had dried out enough to be lighter. Her hands were cold enough that the small hatchet she'd packed another of Callan's tools, short-handled, light enough to carry, required 2 tries to seat properly in her grip. She worked slowly, steadily, without letting herself look up at how much there was still to do. Lashing the branches together at one end took longer than it should have because her fingers kept stiffening in the cold and she kept having to stop and press them against her body to warm them enough to regain useful control. The key din lay. She was on her knees in the snow for part of it, and getting back up the first time left her breathing hard and biting down on what she wanted to say out loud. But the sled came together. Rough and probably not what a carpenter would call a sled, but functional. She hauled pine branches first. Specifically the ones whose bark was still solid and whose interior wood felt dense. These would be her framing, the skeleton of whatever she was going to build. She didn't know yet exactly what the structure would look like. She had a general shape in her mind: 4 walls, low-pitched roof, sized just large enough for 2 people to sleep, and move in without being larger than she could reasonably heat. But the details would come from what she found, not from a plan on paper. She was on her 3rd load of materials when she heard a sound that wasn't wind. She stopped, stood still, listened. Footsteps in snow have a specific quality, a compressed crunch, that's different from branches dropping their loads of snow or animals moving through underbrush. She had spent enough winters listening to them to know what she was hearing. Someone was walking nearby. She straightened up and turned slowly, scanning the trees. An old man stepped out from between 2 pines about 30 feet away. He was carrying a bundle across his shoulders, moving with the careful economy of someone whose body had done this particular work for decades and knew exactly how much energy to spend on it. He had a beard that had gone fully white and a coat that had probably been brown once and had become something else through years of use. He stopped when he saw her. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "Didn't expect to find anyone up here," he said finally. His voice was rougher than she expected, not unfriendly exactly, but not warm either. The kind of voice that hadn't made small talk in a long time. "Neither did I," Tamsin said. He looked at her improvised sled, at the pile of branches she'd loaded onto it, at the hatchet still in her hand, and his expression moved through several things too quickly for her to read all of them. "You're living in that cave," he said. It wasn't a question. "We're living in that cave," she said. "My mother and I." He was quiet for another moment. "Orson Pike," he said. "Tamsin Aldridge." He nodded once, looked at the sky the way people do who've spent enough time outdoors to read it automatically. "Storm coming in 2 days," he said. "Big one, I know. You building something?" "Trying to." He shifted the bundle on his shoulder, looked at her again, a long, assessing look that felt less like judgment and more like simply figuring something out. "I'll be back through in a few days," he said, "maybe." Then he walked back into the trees, and she couldn't hear his footsteps anymore. She stood there for a moment, not quite sure what had just happened, then turned back to her sled and kept working. The stone she'd identified Stones she'd identified along the ridge turned out to be exactly what she'd hoped, sedimentary layers, some of them already loose, that broke into rough, flat sections with enough leverage applied. Her back communicated its displeasure at every stage of this process. She accepted the communication and kept going. She loaded what she could onto the sled in 4 trips, stopping between each one to go inside and check on Brenna, who had organized everything Tamsin had brought in so far into a logic that immediately made sense, like items together, tools accessible, food elevated off the cold floor by a flat stone she'd found near the cave wall. "You didn't just sit here," Tamsin said. "I'm not decorative," Brenna said. They laid the flat stones as a floor section first, in the deepest, most sheltered part of the cave, not the entrance, which would always be cold, but the interior section where the walls narrowed slightly before opening again. The stones weren't level, and they weren't even, and fitting them together took most of a day, both of them working slowly, Brenna handling the smaller pieces and the fitting, while Tamsin moved the heavier ones. By the end of it, Tamsin's lower back had gone past aching, and into a kind of sustained outrage that she breathed through and ignored. But the floor was there. Stone, dry, no longer drawing heat upward from the earth. The frame came next. Pine poles, stripped of their side branches, set upright and lashed together at the top, with rope and strips of leather she'd cut from one of the belts in her pack. The frame was rough, she was not a carpenter, had never built anything structural before, and it showed in the wobble and the uneven gaps. She reinforced the weakest joints with packed clay from a deposit she'd found just outside the cave entrance. Clay that was still workable, because the cave itself moderated the temperature near its entrance slightly. She pressed the clay into joints with her fingers and let it begin to dry. The walls were the problem she'd been thinking about since she first formed the plan. She needed insulation. Real insulation, not just coverage. Pine branches could form a lattice, but lattice alone was porous. She needed something to fill the gaps. Something that trapped air and held heat. Moss worked if you had enough of it. Pine needles worked, though less well. But what she really needed, in volume, were the reeds from the marsh. She couldn't get to the marsh easily. The snow had covered the terrain between the cave and the marsh edge. More importantly, her knees, after 2 days of the most sustained physical labor she'd done in years, were telling her that crossing uncertain frozen ground repeatedly was probably at the outer edge of what they'd tolerate. She sat with this problem for an evening, while she and Brenna ate the last of the dried grain she'd packed, and tried to decide whether what was left some preserved meat wrapped in cloth. A small quantity of dried fruit should be rationed more severely or maintained at current levels. "Rationing too much makes you too weak to work," Brenna said. "And you need to work." "I know." "Then don't starve yourself to extend the supply by 3 days. 3 days won't save us. The building will." Tamsin looked at her mother. In the dim light, they had one candle left, which they used for a few hours at night and then extinguished carefully. Brenna's face was thinner than it had been a week ago, dramatically. But Tamsin noticed it. "You're not eating enough," Tamsin said. "I'm eating exactly enough, Brenna." "I'm old," her mother said matter-of-factly. "I don't burn through food the way you do. I'm not going to pretend I need more than I need, just to make you feel better about the supply." Tamsin started to say something else, and Brenna held up one hand, a gesture that had meant that's enough, since Tamsin was 8 years old, and it still worked. The marsh problem solved itself partly the next morning when Tamsin woke to find that the temperature had dropped further overnight, and the marsh had frozen more solidly than before. She tested it carefully, walking out on it, with a long branch held horizontally across her body, ready to use it as a bridge across the hole if the ice broke under her, and found that it held. Not comfortably, not without protest. The ice shifted under her weight and gave small, alarming pops, and she moved in a slow, deliberate shuffle that was the opposite of anything that looked confident. She cut for 4 hours. Her hands were bleeding by the end of it. The reed edges were sharp, and the cold dried her skin into something fragile that cracked at pressure points. She packed the cuts with a small amount of a healing salve she'd brought, wrapped her palms in strips of cloth, and loaded the reeds onto the sled and dragged them back. The next 3 days were a blur of the same kind of work, repeated and refined. She wove the reeds into panels between the pine poles, not neatly, not the way a craftsperson would have, but tightly enough that the wind couldn't find a direct path through. She packed the gaps with moss and pine needles, and, in the lower sections, more clay. She made a roof from overlapping layers of pine branches angled so that whatever condensation formed would run outward rather than inward. Her body kept a running tally of everything she asked it to do. She stopped pretending the tally wasn't there. She took breaks when she needed to, not when she wanted to, because she never wanted to, but when her knees told her that continuing without a rest was borrowing against a debt she couldn't afford. She learned to sit in ways that kept pressure off the worst joints. She learned which movements she could substitute for each other to spread the load more evenly. Brenna wove beside her for as many hours as she could manage each day. Her hands were more nimble than Tamsin's. At the fine weaving, decades of sewing and mending had given her fingers a precision that Tamsin's hadn't. Couldn't lift things. She couldn't haul materials. But she could take any panel Tamsin had roughed out and make it tighter, more uniform, more structurally sound. "This one's loose here," she'd say, pointing. And she'd rework it without commentary, her fingers moving in the cold with a steadiness that Tamsin found quietly remarkable. On the fourth day, Orson Pike came back. He came without announcement. She heard the footsteps again, and this time she knew what they were and waited at the entrance. He was carrying something over his shoulder, and as he got closer, she could see it was a bundle of animal hides, rolled and tied with a cord. He stopped a few feet from her. "Set the bundle down on the snow." "Here," he said. "2 of them." Didn't need all of it. He was lying, or at least reshaping the truth. A trapper didn't not need all of 2 deer hides. But she understood this was the form his offering was going to take, and she accepted it in the form he offered. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. He was looking past her into the cave entrance, where the frame of what she was building was visible from the outside. "Pine and reed," he said, "and clay and moss." "Smart," he said. "Just that. Not impressive, or I wouldn't have thought of that, just an assessment, level and direct." "I need it to hold heat," she said. "I don't know if the clay is setting fast enough. Temperature's not right for it. Mix ash into it," he said. "From your fire you got a fire?" "Not yet. That's next. When you do. Mix the ash into the clay before you apply it. Helps it bind and dry faster." She filed this away. "I'll do that." He picked up the bundle again, set it against the cave wall near the entrance. "There's a creek," he said, "about a half-mile northeast of here. Doesn't freeze until deep January. Fish in it." She looked at him. "I know," he said, and he almost sounded like he was going to say something else. But then he just turned and walked back into the trees the way he had before. She stood at the entrance for a moment, then picked up the hides and brought them inside. Brenna looked at them. "Who?" she asked. "Trapper. Name's Orson Pike. He lives out here alone?" "Seems like it." Brenna ran her hand over the hides. "Good quality, tanned well, still flexible, despite the cold." "Not everyone in this world is Garrick Vane," she said. "No," Tamsin agreed. "Not everyone." The hides went on the walls first, not as the outer layer, but as an inner lining between the woven reed panels and the interior space. The insulating value of animal hide, Tamsin knew, was significant. It had kept human beings alive in climates far worse than this one for thousands of years. She tacked them into place with small wooden she'd carved laboriously from split pine, pressing each peg through the hide and into the gaps in the pole framework. The structure was beginning to look like something. It was not beautiful. She would never claim it was beautiful. The walls were uneven, the reed weaving varied in density. From section to section, the roof had a slight sag on the left side that she'd tried twice to correct and finally accepted as a permanent feature. But it had walls, it had a roof. It had a floor of flat stone. It had hide lining and reed insulation and clay-packed gaps. The last thing was the fireplace. She had been thinking about it the entire time, working through the prop at the edges of everything else she did. Fires inside a cave required ventilation. Without ventilation, smoke would fill the space and kill them faster than the cold would. But adding an opening to the cave's ceiling was obviously not something she could accomplish from inside. What she needed was a natural one. And there was a natural one. She'd noticed it early, a fissure in the cave ceiling, the interior section, a crack roughly 3 inches wide and running for about 2 feet that she'd dismissed initially as a structural feature. But she watched it out over several days and noticed on one cold morning that a thin column of her breath rose directly toward it and was drawn upward. Not just rising naturally. Being drawn, there was airflow through the fissure. which meant there was a path for smoke. She'd built the hearth below it. Flat stones again, stacked carefully into a three-sided enclosure, the opening facing inward toward where they slept. She packed the joints with the ash-mixed clay Orson had described, applying it carefully and letting it dry in stages. The back wall of the hearth was thicker, it would absorb heat and release it slowly, which meant the fire would do more work per unit of wood than a simple, open flame. She had been thinking about this for days, working out the proportions by reasoning rather than experience, and she was not certain it would work. The first fire was a small one, dry pine needles, then the fine dry twigs from the dead branches, built up in a pyramid the way Callan had always done. She lit it with the flint she'd packed. This had been a conscious decision, tucked into her bag almost as an afterthought, and she was grateful to her past self for making it. The flame caught, small and yellow and honest. She watched the smoke. For a moment it drifted sideways and her stomach dropped, because sideways smoke meant her ventilation theory was wrong, and this wasn't going to work. And she had built all of this on a false assumption. Then the draft from the fissure found it. The smoke column straightened, turned vertical, moved upward with a steadiness that became more definite as the fire grew and the draft strengthened. And she watched it rise toward the crack in the stone ceiling and disappear into it and was absolutely gone. Tamsin sat back on her heels and let herself breathe. Brenna was behind her, standing very still. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then warmth, not dramatic warmth, not the warmth of a proper hearth in a proper house, but warmth, real and growing and real, began to move outward from the stone enclosure and spread across the floor of the space they'd built. Brenna sat down on the stone floor and held her hands toward the fire and closed her eyes. Tamsin looked at what they had made. Rough walls of woven reed and pine. Stone floor, uneven but solid. Roof of layered branches above a frame that held. Hide lining that had already begun, in the day they'd been up, to smell less cold. A fire burning below a natural chimney, venting cleanly into open air above. She thought about Garrick Vane standing on her porch, about the flat, satisfied certainty in his face when he'd said safe travels, about the crowd that had watched her go and said nothing. She thought about what they had expected when they drove her out here. Thought, they expected me to die. She was so tired that her hands were shaking slightly, and she was sitting on stone with her knees, providing their usual ongoing report of grievances, and she hadn't slept a proper night since they'd left Redwillow Crossing, and she was going to need to find a significant amount of food before the supplies they had left ran out. None of that changed what she was looking at. She had built a home inside a mountain, not a perfect one, not one anyone would publish in a book about frontier construction, but one that had walls and a floor and a fire that burned clean and would be warm enough for two people to survive winter inside it. The woman they'd driven into the wilderness with nothing had built a home out of the wilderness itself. She added 3 more pieces of wood to the fire, adjusted the angle of the larger one for better airflow, and then lay down on the stone floor beside her mother and pulled the blanket over both of them and was asleep before she finished her next thought. Outside, the snow kept falling. The wind moved around the hill and found nothing it could reach. Inside, the fire burned steadily through the night. The fire didn't solve everything. She wanted to be clear about that, at least to herself, because there was a version of this story where the first successful flame meant the hard part was over, and that version would have gotten them killed. What the fire solved was the most immediate problem, dying from cold in their sleep. What it didn't solve was food, which was becoming a calculation she could no longer defer. What it didn't solve was water, which required melting snow in the single clay vessel she'd shaped and fired imperfectly, with a crack along one side she'd sealed with more clay and hoped would hold, because the creek Orson had mentioned was a half-mile away, and she wasn't yet confident enough in the ice conditions to make that walk regularly. What it didn't solve was the slow but measurable depletion of firewood, which required daily collection and meant she couldn't rest the way her body was increasingly requesting. The first week after the fire started, she settled into a rhythm that was less like survival and more like the kind of grinding, unglamorous maintenance work that survival actually consists of. Up before full light, assess the fire, add wood if needed, adjust the airflow, melt snow for water, eat something small and calorie-dense from the dwindling supply. Check Brenna. go out and collect firewood from the dead lower branches, loading what she could onto the sled and dragging it back in loads that got the job done without destroying her knees in a single morning. She started keeping a rough mental ledger. Firewood in versus firewood burned. Food remaining versus days until it ran out. Physical capacity her own, and Brenna's versus what each day demanded. The ledger didn't balance comfortably. It never did. But it told her which problems were urgent and which could wait, and that alone was worth the daily discipline of doing it. Brenna was better in the warmth. Not transformed, she was still 70, still moving carefully over uneven stone floors, still needing more sleep than she'd ever admitted to needing in her life. But the frightening shallowness that Tamsin had tracked in her breathing during those first 2 nights was gone. She ate what Tamsin put in front of her without argument, which was not typical Brenna behavior, and told Tamsin that her mother understood the situation clearly enough not to perform stubbornness about food. She also started helping with the weaving again. Tamsin had left sections of the wall deliberately unfinished, partly because she'd run short of reed panels, and partly because she knew that giving Brenna purposeful work to do was as important to her mother's well-being as food and warmth. Brenna never thanked her for this. Brenna would have considered thanks and acknowledgement that she needed managing, which she would not have tolerated. But she picked up the unfinished section and worked at it for 2 hours each morning without being asked, her fingers finding their rhythm in the cold, and by the end of the first week, the wall had no significant gaps left. It was during the second week that the food problem became something she couldn't defer any longer. She rationed what they had left down to a single small meal each day, not by choice, by necessity, and with the clear-eyed recognition that she was stretching a supply that wasn't going to stretch far enough regardless. She needed to find food. She'd been thinking about it since they arrived and delaying the direct confrontation with it because there were other urgent things. But those other things were now sufficiently stable that she had no more excuses. She didn't know how to trap efficiently. That was a plain fact she had to work around rather than pretend away. She knew the principles she'd read about it in the same trapper's manual she'd read with Callan, but reading about something and doing it in frozen wilderness were different problems entirely. She set 3 snares near areas where she'd seen small tracks in the snow, pressing the thin wire she'd brought into configurations she thought she remembered correctly, without much confidence in the result. The creek Orson had told her about was the better bet. She made the walk on a morning when the temperature had risen slightly, meaning it was still far below freezing, but the air had lost the particular bite that made her face feel like it was being abraded. The Tolstoy-like. She took the long branch with her for testing ice and moved across the terrain with the careful economy of someone who had learned exactly what her body's current limits were. The creek was where Orson had said it would be, and it was not frozen. Moving water, narrower than she'd expected but fast enough to stay clear, and she stood on its bank and looked at it and felt something release in her chest. She had no fishing gear. This had occurred to her before she left. She'd brought, instead, a piece of wire bent into a rough hook shape, a length of thread from Brenna's mending kit, and a strip of preserved meat thin enough to serve as bait without wasting significant calories. The hook was probably wrong. The thread wasn't fishing line. The bait was probably too small. She cut a sapling branch for a rod, tied the thread to it, worked the hook through the strip of meat, and stood on the bank in the cold with her boots 15 inches from moving water, and her arms extended, and her face doing whatever it was doing, and she fished. It was not elegant. Nothing about any of this was elegant, and she'd stopped expecting it to be. Elegant was for people who had planned ahead and brought proper equipment. She had wire and thread and stubbornness. The first fish hit the line 40 minutes later. It wasn't large. She nearly lost it twice. The makeshift hook didn't seat properly, and she had to keep tension on the line at exactly the right angle, which she figured out more through instinct than understanding. But she got it onto the bank and put her hand over it before it could work its way back into the water, and she sat there on the frozen ground with a fish in her hands and her heart hammering the way it does when something works that you weren't entirely sure would work. She caught 2 more before the cold became too much to stay. 3 fish, total, small. Enough for 2 real meals, maybe 3 if stretched carefully, and more importantly, proof that the creek was viable that she could come back, that they had a protein source that wasn't going to run out before spring. She was on her way back to the cave, the fish wrapped in cloth and packed against her body to keep them from freezing solid before she could cook them, when she heard movement in the trees ahead and to her left. Not wind, not a branch dropping snow. Deliberate movement. She stopped. Orson stepped out from between two trees. He was carrying something again, a bundle that resolved, as he got closer, into smoked meat, wrapped in burlap. He looked at the cloth bundle she was pressing against herself and raised his eyebrows slightly. "Creek," she said. He nodded. "Good." He held out the burlap bundle. "Got more than I need." She accepted it. The same reshaping of truth as last time. She didn't challenge it. "You're going to keep doing this," she said. "Just noting." "Might pass by," he said. "Orson." She looked at him directly. "Why?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "My wife. Long time ago, settlement 3 days east of here," a pause. "Winter like this one. People decided she was the problem. Because she knew things they didn't understand." He didn't say what happened to his wife. He didn't have to. "I'm sorry," Tamsin said. "Didn't stop it," he said. "Was young and stupid and believed people would see reason." He looked away into the trees. "They don't, particularly. See reason." He shifted his weight. "You're not going to die out here." Figured I'd make sure of that. He turned and walked back into the trees before she could say anything else. She stood there for a moment, holding the burlap bundle. Then she went home. The word had arrived in her mind without her deciding to use it home, and she noticed it the way you notice an unexpected sound in a familiar place. She turned it over as she walked. The cave. The rough stone walls and the uneven floor and the reed panels. Brenna was still tightening and the fire burning beneath its chimney fissure. That was home now. Not the house in Redwillow Crossing that Garrick Vane was sleeping in. This. The thought made her feel something complicated that she didn't fully work through, because the path back required attention and she needed to be paying attention. The snares yielded 2 rabbits over the next 4 days. Both were caught in ways that suggested she'd set the wire slightly wrong and they'd gotten themselves tangled through persistence rather than because her snares had functioned correctly. She adjusted the configurations for the next round. Get better at it. She was already getting better at everything else, which mostly just meant accumulating enough failures to understand what the right version looked like. The fish supplemented the meat. The smoked supply Orson had brought would last them a week if they were careful. Combined with what she was pulling from the creek every other day, they had enough. Not comfortably, not the kind of enough that stopped your stomach from saying something about it in the evenings, but functional enough, working enough. She started expanding the shelter. Not the main sleeping space, which she was actually reasonably satisfied with in terms of its thermal performance on particularly cold nights. She'd noticed it holding warmth for hours after she banked the fire, which suggested the insulation was doing what it was supposed to. But the storage. She needed space for firewood that was inside the cave's protection but outside the main shelter, where it would stay dry without adding humidity to the interior air. And she needed what she'd started thinking of as a cold room, a section of the cave near the entrance, cold enough to preserve food but protected from the wind, where she could store fish and meat without having them freeze rock solid or, in the other direction, thaw and spoil. The expansion took another week. Slower this time because her body had renegotiated certain terms with her and she was respecting the new contract more than she'd respected the original. She took actual rest days, not days where she felt guilty about not working and did half as much while telling herself she was resting, but days where she genuinely sat by the fire and let her joints have the quiet they were asking for. On the first of these, Brenna sat next to her and they talked for a long time in a way they hadn't talked since before Callan died, not about survival logistics, not about what needed to be done, just about things, about people they'd known, about times that were gone, about what Callan would have said about various aspects of this situation, and some of those things made them both laugh in the helpless, slightly pained way of people who miss someone enough that laughing about them hurts and helps at the same time. It was in the 3rd week that the first truly severe weather arrived. Not snow, they'd had snow continuously, light and heavy by turns, and she'd adapted her routines around it. This was different. A pressure drop she felt in her sinuses before she could see any evidence of it in the sky. a specific stillness in the air outside the cave that she associated from years of reading the sky with Callan, with the silence before something serious. She spent the entire day before it hit hauling firewood. Not her usual measured loads, but as much as she could physically move, trip after trip, until her legs were trembling and she was breathing so hard that she had to stop between trips and stand with her hands on her thighs and wait for her vision to stop doing what it was doing. Brenna watched the second to last trip and said, carefully, "How bad?" "Don't know exactly," Tamsin said. "Bad enough that I want 4 days of wood inside before it starts." "Do you have 4 days?" "Getting there." "Sit down for a moment." Tamsin. Brenna's voice was quiet, just that, her name. But there was something in it that bypassed argument and went directly to the place where Tamsin still listened to her mother, unconditionally, the way she had at 8 years old. She sat down. Brenna handed her the tin cup of warm water she'd kept heated by the fire. Tamsin drank it. Her hands were shaking. She hadn't until she was holding the cup and could feel the liquid moving around inside it. "One more load," Brenna said. "Then you're done for today. Whatever happens tomorrow, you can't help us if you've broken yourself today." Tamsin sat with that. "One more load," she agreed. Storms hit the following morning. She knew the moment she woke. Because the sound outside the cave changed, that had been a constant low note became something else entirely. A deeper and more serious sound that moved through the hill itself and made the reed walls flex slightly inward. The temperature inside dropped despite the fire, which meant the cold outside had gone beyond what the cave's natural moderation could fully absorb. She built the fire hotter than she'd been running it. That was a conscious trade burn. More wood per hour, generate more heat, accept the short supply in exchange for maintaining the interior temperature at a survivable level. It was the right call, she was sure of it. But it meant the wood supply she'd worked herself to exhaustion accumulating was disappearing faster than the comfortable version of her plan had anticipated. For 4 days, they barely left the shelter. 4 days of the wind-making sounds she'd never heard before sometimes, like something structural was happening to the hillside, the kind of deep groaning that made her look up at the cave ceiling with a very specific kind of attention. She told herself that a cave which had been here for centuries was not going to choose this particular winter to collapse. She didn't tell Brenna that she'd thought this thought, because Brenna would have known she was managing her own fear and would have had something dry to say about it. 4 days of carefully rationed food, of fire management, of the particular cabin fever that sets in when 2 people are confined to a space roughly the size of a modest room, and there is nowhere to go and nothing to do but exist together and wait. They argued once. It was about something small, the arrangement of the firewood storage, which Tamsin had set up one way, and Brenna reorganized for reasons that made logical sense but required moving everything. The argument was not really about the firewood. The argument was about being afraid and confined and missing ordinary life, and after about 3 minutes, they both knew it. And Brenna said, "I'm moving it back." And Tamsin said, "You don't have to." And Brenna said, "I do." It was working fine, and they were quiet for a while, and then Tamsin said, "I'm sorry." And Brenna said, "I know," and that was the end of it. On the 4th night, the wind dropped. Not gradually it dropped, with the kind of decisiveness that weather sometimes has, going from that overwhelming deep roar to near silence over the course of about 20 minutes. She lay awake, listening to the silence fill in where the sound had been, and she felt the tension she'd been carrying in her shoulders. For 4 days begin, very slowly, to release. The morning after the storm was the clearest she'd seen since leaving Redwillow Crossing. The kind of blue sky that appears after bad weather has scraped everything else away. She stood at the cave entrance in the white stillness and looked at a landscape transformed. The snow was deep enough in places that the familiar shapes of trees and ground had changed entirely, drifted into forms she didn't recognize. The world looked newly made, empty and clean and indifferent. She was on her way to the creek fish, always more fish. It was becoming the stable rhythm of her mornings when she heard something at the cave entrance. A sound. Not wind, not animals, not the natural percussion of snow falling from branches. Scratching. She turned around, looked at the cave entrance, which was half buried by a drift the storm had built against the hillside, stood very still and listened. The scratching came again, irregular, weak. The kind of sound that a person makes when they no longer have the strength to knock or call out when the best their body can manage is the most basic animal signal. Here, here, I am here. Something is still here. She moved back to the entrance, fast. Started digging with her hands, pulling snow away from the drift, piling it to the side in armloads that were heavy and awkward. Her gloves were wet through in 2 minutes. Her lower back announced its position on this activity immediately. She kept digging. The scratching got slightly louder as she got closer to its source. And then she pulled back a section of drift and found, curled against the base of the hill just to the right of the entrance, a person. Moksite Nokli, a woman, barely recognizable as one. The clothing was so covered in ice and compacted snow that the shape was wrong, and the face, what was visible of it above the scarf she'd wrapped over her mouth, was white in the wrong way. The bloodless, waxy white of skin that has been cold past the point of the body's ability to manage it. Tamsin stared at the face. It was Elowen. For a moment, a brief, honest moment that she was not going to pretend hadn't happened. She felt nothing. Not anger, not pity, not the instinctive urgency of someone seeing another person in danger. Just a flat, empty recognition that the woman who had watched her walk away, without saying a word, was snow outside her cave door dying. Then the moment passed, and she was already moving. She got her hands under Elowen's arms and pulled. Elowen was a smaller woman than Tamsin, and her body had gone partially rigid with cold, which made her both easier and harder to move easier, because the rigidity gave her shape something to work with. Harder because it meant she couldn't help at all, and was being moved entirely by Tamsin's effort. Tamsin dragged her backward, through the entrance, across the outer cave floor, and into the warmth of the main shelter. Brenna was already on her feet. She looked at Elowen's face, and then at Tamsin, and said nothing, but she moved to the fire and began stoking it higher, and she took the second blanket from the sleeping area and brought it over. "Who is she?" Brenna asked, though something in her voice suggested she might already know. "Elowen," Tamsin said. A beat of silence. "Ah," Brenna said. "Just that." Tamsin was already working on Elowen's outer layers, ice-stiffened cloth that had to be peeled away carefully. She'd read once, in the same manual, that with severe cold exposure, you did not put someone directly against a heat source. Gradual rewarming. The body needed time for the blood to adjust, and doing it too fast caused problems she didn't fully understand but trusted the warning about. She laid Elowen near the fire, not against it. Wrapped her in the blanket, put her own gloved hands around Elowen's, and held them. Elowen's eyes were open. That was a good sign she was conscious, though barely, in the dull, barely their way of someone who has been using all available resources just to stay that far above the line. "You're inside," Tamsin said. "You're warm. Stay awake." Elowen's lips moved. Nothing came out. "Don't try to talk yet. Just stay awake." She worked through the next hour with the focus of someone who has decided the outcome and is simply doing what it takes to produce it. Warm the extremities slowly. "Keep her talking," she asked Elowen simple questions when Elowen seemed present enough to answer, just to track her level of consciousness. Brenna heated water with some of the dried herbs Tamsin had packed specifically because they supported circulation, and they got small amounts of it into Elowen in careful sips. Elowen didn't ask why Tamsin was helping her. Either the question hadn't formed yet in her cold-fogged mind, or some part of her knew the answer, or she simply didn't have the resources to spend on anything that wasn't survival. She drank what was put in front of her and stayed awake when asked to, and gradually, over the course of that hour, the wrong white in her face began to give way to something that looked more like a human being was living behind it. When the color had returned enough, and Elowen's shivering had shifted from the dangerous stillness of deep cold to the active, violent shivering that actually meant her body was working again, Tamsin sat back and let herself breathe. Brenna caught her eye across the fire. Tamsa gave a small shake of her head, not a bad sign, just not yet. Brenna nodded and went back to the fire. Elowen slept for several hours. Tamsin used the time to do what she should have done that morning, before the scratching interrupted her collected firewood. Checked the snares, made the trip to the creek. When she came back, Elowen's was still sleeping, and Brenna was sitting beside her with the mending she'd been working on for the past week, her needle moving in small, precise stitches. "You could have left her outside," Brenna said, without looking up. "I know, she let you walk away." "I know that, too." Brenna stitched 3 more stitches. "I'm not criticizing. I'm observing. I know what you're doing. A brief silence. What are you doing? Brenna asked. Tamsin set down the firewood she'd brought in and stacked it in the storage section. I don't know yet, she said honestly. Ask me when she's warm enough to talk. Elowen woke near evening. She lay still for a moment, looking at the reed walls and the firelight moving on the stone ceiling, clearly working out where she was and how she'd gotten there. Then she turned her head and found Tamsin sitting 5 feet away, and the complicated thing that moved across her face was not simple to describe. You're alive, Elowen said. Her voice was wrecked, thick and rough, and a little wrong-sounding still. Clearly, Tamsin said. Elowen's eyes moved around the space. The walls, the floor, the fire and its clean chimney draft, stored food, the organized, functional interior of a shelter built by hand in the middle of winter from raw materials. You built this, she said. We built it, Tamsin said. Brenna too. Elowen looked at Brenna, who looked back at her steadily and said nothing. Tamsin. Elowen's voice broke slightly on the second syllable, which was probably still partly the cold and partly not. Not yet, Tamsin said. Whatever you're going to say, it can wait until you can say it without falling apart. Eat something first, I have to tell you. Elowen, Tamsin's voice was firm, not cruel. I'm not going anywhere. Neither are you, not tonight. Eat something and sleep again, and tell me in the morning. Elowen looked at her for a long moment. Then she closed her mouth and accepted the small portion of food Brenna held out to her, and she ate it without speaking. That night, Tamsin lay awake for a long time, listening to the 2 other people, breathing in the shelter her mother's familiar, quiet rhythm and Elowen's still slightly ragged one, gradually evening out as she slept. She thought about the sequence of decisions that had led to this moment and tried to identify the one she was least sure about. She couldn't find it. Every decision that had gone wrong had been forced on her. Everything she'd built since had been her own. She fell asleep with the fire low and steady and the hill around them holding everything inside it close. In the morning, Elowen told her everything. She didn't lead up to it gradually or arrange it into something manageable. She sat up the sleeping area with the blanket pulled around her and her face still showing the marks that severe cold leaves on skin, and she talked. Garrick had not simply taken Tamsin's land. He had reorganized the settlement's entire resource structure around himself. He'd claimed the community's shared grain stores were being managed centrally, his phrase. Elowen said, which meant controlled who got food and who didn't. He'd moved the communal firewood to a location adjacent to his property. People who expressed reservations were suddenly receiving smaller allocations. People who supported him publicly were doing better than those who stayed quiet. He made it so that questioning him cost you, Elowen said, directly, in things you needed to live. That's not new, Tamsin said. That's how he always operated. It's different now. Before it was about influence. Now it's... Elowen stopped. There are families going cold, Tamsin. He's not distributing the firewood evenly. There are children in those cabins. Tamsin looked at her. The Hendry family, Elowen said. Their youngest, she's 4 years old. They haven't had enough wood for 4 days. Silence. Marcus Prether told Garrick that the allocation wasn't fair. Elowen continued. Marcus, who voted to drive you out, who told you to sit down. She paused. Garrick took his next week's grain, just removed it from the record, as an example. The fire made its small, steady sounds. Tamsin thought about the 4-day storm she'd just survived inside walls she'd built, with her own hands and her mother's careful fingers and an old trapper's random acts of decency. She thought about what that storm would have been like in a cabin with insufficient firewood and a 4-year-old child. How long did it take you to walk here? She asked. I left 3 days before the storm hit, Elowen said. I thought I knew roughly where you'd gone, from watching the direction you walked. I was wrong about the distance, and I got caught in the storm on the last day. She looked at her hands, which were still slightly discolored at the fingertips. I thought I was going to die in the snow. You almost did. I know. A pause. I came to warn you. In case Garrick, I didn't know if he'd decided you were still a threat somehow and might send someone after you. But mostly I came because she stopped. Tried again. Because I didn't say anything when they drove you out. And I knew what he was. And I thought if I just kept my head down and didn't make trouble, I could survive it and wait for spring, and then somehow it would... Her voice had lost its footing. I told myself a lot of things that were easier than doing the right thing. The fire, the stone floor, the reed walls, uneven and hand-built and solid. Tamsin looked at Elowin for a long time. I know, Tamsin said finally. Elowin looked up. I know that's what you told yourself, Tamsin said. People do that. People do it all the time. It doesn't make you uniquely cowardly, it makes you human and afraid. She let that sit for a moment. I'm angry at you. I want you to know that. I'm not pretending I'm not. Elowin nodded very slightly. But there are children without firewood, Tamsin said. Another nod. Tamsin looked at the walls of the home she'd built. She looked at the fire. She looked at the stored food and the firewood stacked in the outer section and the hide-lined walls and the stone hearth that drew clean. Then she looked at Elowin. Can you walk tomorrow? She asked. Elowin blinked. Something shifted in her expression, a rearrangement of what she'd expected this conversation to become. Walk where? She asked. Back toward Redwillow Crossing, Tamsin said. Elowin stared at her. Tamsin. Garrick is not my primary concern right now, Tamsin said. A 4-year-old child with no firewood is my primary concern. You'd go back. After everything that... Can you walk tomorrow or not? A long silence. Outside, a wind moved through the pines. Inside, the fire burned as it had burned since the night she'd lit it, steadily and without drama, doing the work it was built to do. Yes, Elowin said quietly, I can walk tomorrow. Brinna, who had been sitting near the fire and had said nothing, for the last half hour, set down her mending. She looked at Tamsin. Her expression held everything. It always held the particular attention of a woman who had watched her daughter since his birth and understood, better than anyone else, what she was made of. She didn't say it was a good idea. She didn't say it was a bad one. She said, then you need to sleep first, both of you. Outside, the frontier lay under its white silence. The settlement, 3 miles away in cabins, going cold, people who had believed they were making a reasonable choice when they drove Tamsin Aldridge into the winter were discovering what they'd actually done. They'd sent away their best chance. And she was already deciding to come back. She didn't sleep as well as she should have. The decision to go back to Redwillow Crossing was made, and she didn't doubt it. That wasn't the problem. The problem was the part that came after the decision, which was the planning. Most of its windows were dark, and her mind kept working through it in the dark the way it worked through everything, methodically, without sentimentality, identifying the variables she could control and the ones she couldn't. Elowin had said Garrick controlled the grain and the firewood. Most of its windows were dark. That meant he controlled what people needed most, which meant he controlled what people would do to keep getting it. Going back and simply announcing herself was not a plan, it was a way to give Garrick advance notice and let him frame whatever happened next on his own terms. She'd watched him do exactly that at the community gathering. He was good at framing. She was not going to walk into that again. What she needed was to reach the families before she reached Garrick. Get to the people directly, cabin by cabin if necessary. Don't it sound simply appear and help, and let the helping speak, before Garrick had a chance to explain why they shouldn't accept it. She ran through who she knew and what she knew about them. The Hendry family, Elowin had mentioned them specifically, the 4-year-old, the firewood situation. She knew where their cabin was, roughly at the northeast edge of the settlement, which happened to also be the edge furthest from Garrick's property. That was where she'd start. She finally fell into something resembling sleep around what she estimated was 2 in the morning and woke before the sky lightened, which was usual. Elowin was already awake. She was sitting up with the blanket around her shoulders, looking at the fire, and she had the expression of someone who'd been awake for a while and hadn't enjoyed it. Did you sleep? Tamsin asked. Some. Elowin looked at her. I keep thinking about the things I should have said at the meeting. When you stood up and talked, and then Marcus told you to sit down, and nobody I should have said something. Probably, Tamsin agreed. Elowin blinked. She'd maybe expected comfort or deflection, or the particular social grace of pretending the past was less bad than it was. I'm not going to tell you it didn't matter, Tamsin said. She was sitting up now, reaching for her boots, working them onto feet that protested the cold of the stone floor, the way they always did first thing in the morning. It mattered. What you did, what you didn't do it, mattered. That's the true thing, and I'm not going to say otherwise. So how are you? Elowin stopped. How am I what? Functional about it? Tamsin worked the second boot on. Because I don't have time not to be. Because there are children without firewood, and I'm the one who knows how to move through this terrain and build heat, and I'm not going to let them freeze because I'm too busy being rightfully angry at you to do anything useful about it. She stood up. I'll be angry at you on the other side of this. Right now we have work to do. She left Elowin sitting with that and went to assess the fire. Brenna was awake, too. She was already heating water, had already set out what passed for breakfast the last of Orson's smoked meat, divided into 3 equal portions that Tamsin could tell had been calculated carefully. You're not coming, Tamsin said to her. I know, Brenna said. Tamsin looked at her mother. She'd expected an argument. The lack of one was almost more unsettling. The walk is too far in these conditions, Tamsin said, explaining it anyway. And somebody needs to maintain the fire and the shelter. If something goes wrong and we have to come back, Tamsin, Brenna said quietly. I know, I'm not arguing. She handed her the portion of meat. Eat this, and take more food than you think you'll need. The families you find aren't going to have eaten properly in days. Tamsin took the food. She stood there for a moment, looking at her mother, this small, upright woman who had walked 2 days through a freezing frontier, slept in a cave, helped build walls with her hands, and was now calmly making strategic assessments about food distribution at dawn. You're the most competent person I know, Tamsin said. I know that too, Brenna said. Go. They loaded what they could carry without the load becoming its own problem. Tamsin had thought about the sled it would let her carry more, but in deep post-storm snow with uncertain terrain, dragging a loaded sled would slow them to a pace that cost more time than the extra supplies were worth. They filled 2 packs instead. Tamsin took the heavier one without discussion. Elowin watched this with an expression that was becoming familiar, the look of someone recalibrating what they thought they understood about another person. They left when the light was enough to see by. Not full light, the sun didn't clear the tree line for another hour, but the blue-gray of early winter morning that gave enough visibility to move without testing every step. The terrain between the cave and Redwillow Crossing was different after the storm. The storm had deposited an additional 1.5 feet of snow in some places, and scoured others nearly bare, creating an uneven landscape that required more attention than the walk Tamsin had made to the creek and back. She led. Elowin followed in her tracks, which was tactically correct. Tamsin's weight compressed the snow ahead and gave Elowin a more stable path, and Tamsin knew the terrain better from her weeks of moving through it. Her knees were doing what they did in deep cold. She acknowledged this and kept going. The first mile was the hardest because the ground between the cave's hillside and the open terrain beyond the tree line was still rough with the debris. The storm had moved fallen branches, drifted snow hiding uneven ground underneath. A section where a creek tributary had overflowed its banks and then frozen into a corrugated surface that had to be crossed slowly and carefully. She broke through the ice surface twice up to mid-shin and spent the energy of hauling herself out both times, and kept moving. Elowin broke through once and went down on one knee. Tamsin shrank back and got a hand under her arm without comment, and they kept going. By the time they crossed into the open terrain that separated the forested hills from the settlement proper, the sun had cleared the tree line, and the snow-covered landscape was the kind of blindingly reflective white that made her eyes ache. She squinted and kept a steady pace. How far out are we? Elowin asked. Cold had put the rough quality back in her voice. Maybe 40 minutes from the Hendry cabin. An hour from the settlement center. If Garrick sees you, don't worry about that yet. Tamsin Elowin. She didn't slow down. Worry about the things in front of you. There's enough of them. They didn't talk much after that. Walking in cold, that deep didn't encourage conversation. It took resources that were better used elsewhere. Tamsin focused on the path, on reading the snow surface ahead for what was under it, on maintaining a pace that was fast enough to cover ground, and slow enough not to arrive at the first cabin in a state where she couldn't function. The Hendry cabin appeared through the trees as a dark shape against the white. No smoke from the chimney. That was the first thing she noticed, and it settled in her stomach like a stone. No smoke meant no fire. No fire in this cold meant the interior temperature would have dropped to somewhere barely above the outside air, within a few hours of the last fuel burning out. She moved faster. Her knees submitted a formal complaint. She ignored it and moved faster anyway. She knocked on the door, not the careful social knock of a visitor, but the loud, saucid knock of someone who needed to be heard through walls and wool and probably 2 or 3 layers of clothing that the people inside were wearing to stay warm. Silence, then movement. Then the door opened, and Hester Hendry was standing there, and her face did something complicated and involuntary at the sight of Tamsin that moved through surprise and confusion and something that might have been relief before landing. On an expression she was clearly trying to control. She was thin, noticeably thinner than when Tamsin had last seen her, back before the harvest. Her eyes were dark underneath, and her lips were cracked from cold. "Tamsin," she said. Her voice had nothing in it. No hostility. No welcome. Just the flat registration of a person too tired for a more elaborate response. "Can I come in?" Tamsin said. Hester stepped back. The interior of the cabin was cold. Not as cold as outside, but cold in a way that told Tamsin immediately that the fire had been out for longer than one morning. She could see her breath. She could see the children, 2 of them, both wrapped in every piece of cloth in the cabin, to judge by the piled layers, sitting together on the bed. The older one was maybe 7. The 4-year-old Elowen had mentioned was small and dark-eyed and watching Tamsin with the particular unnerving calm of a young child who has learned to be very quiet. On the hearth, a small amount of ash and nothing else. "When did the wood run out?" Tamsin asked. Hester looked at the hearth. "Yesterday morning." "Where's your husband?" "He went to request more from the allocation. Yesterday afternoon." A pause that contained everything it needed to. "He hasn't come back." Tamsin and Elowen looked at each other. "I have wood in my pack," Tamsin said, already pulling it off. "Not much enough to get a fire going and get this place warm. The rest of what I have is food. Your children need to eat something before anything else." Hester stood there while Tamsin moved past her to the hearth and started building a fire with the wood she'd packed dry, small pieces good for catching quickly. She had the flint from her own kit, and the fire was lit within 5 minutes. "Why are you here?" Hester asked. She wasn't asking it the hostile way. She was asking it the genuine way. The way people ask questions they actually don't have an answer to. "Because your youngest is 4 years old," Tamsin said, without turning from the hearth. Silence. The fire caught. The small yellow flame expanded into something more committed, and within minutes the immediate area in front of the hearth was producing actual warmth. The 4-year-old unwrapped herself from one of her layers and moved toward it with the unerring instinct of small children for heat. Elowen was already opening her pack, the food portion, the dried meat and grain and the preserved items Tamsin had calculated they could bring without stripping the cave supply below a survivable level. She set it on the table and began organizing it without asking for permission, which was the right call. Tamsin turned to Hester. "I need to know what's happening. All of it. Not the version that's careful about Garrick, what's actually happening." Hester sat down on the bench near the hearth. She looked at the fire for a moment. Then she started talking. It was worse than Elowen had described, partly because Elowen had left before the last week of deterioration and only knew what she'd seen. Garrick had formalized his control with a document, an actual written record, which he'd had witnessed by 3 men who were receiving better allocations than everyone else, declaring himself settlement administrator with authority over communal resources during the winter emergency. He'd framed it as necessary organization. 2 families had refused to sign acknowledgement of his authority. The following week, their allocations had been reduced by half. "He calls the wood an allocation," Hester said. "Like it's generous. It's a gift. That wood came from communal logging 2 summers ago. Belongs to all of us. He calls it an allocation." Fire popped. The 4-year-old held her hands toward it and looked satisfied. "Where does he keep it?" Tamsin asked. "The wood, the grain physically, where is it stored?" Hester looked at her. "Why? Because I'm going to need to know how to get to it." "Tamsin, if you try to take anything from Garrick's "I'm not going to take anything," Tamsin said. "I'm going to make it available to the people it belongs to." She said it simply, without heat. "Where is it?" Hester told her. The grain was in the large storage building behind Garrick's property, the one that had been built communally the summer before last, using labor from every family in the settlement. The firewood was stacked behind the same building, with more in the barn. "Who's with him?" Tamsin asked. "Who's actually supporting him versus who's just scared?" 3 men who get better allocations," Hester said. "Wade Coulter, the 2 Birch brothers. They follow him around and She stopped. "They're not good people. Or they weren't before. I don't know which way it goes. Is anyone else out of wood right now? Besides you?" The elderly couple at the south end, the Vermers. I think the Rosen family, though I haven't seen them in 3 days. And she stopped again, this time differently. The Prethers. Tamsin looked at her. Marcus, Hester said. After he spoke up, Garrick cut them off. Dorothy has a newborn. The baby was born 11 days ago. Her voice dropped slightly. I don't know how they've been managing. A newborn, in a cabin losing heat. Tamsin stood up. Is there anyone in this settlement, she said, who has resources they're not controlled by Garrick? Firewood, food, anything people who've held back private stores. Hester thought about it. Old Vermeer, maybe. He's cagey about everything. And the Hollis family, they have their own woodlot, and they've kept quiet and stayed out of Garrick's way. I don't know if they have extra, all right? Tamsin picked up her pack. Get your children fed. Keep the fire going, burn what I brought, and I'll send more. Don't open the door for anyone except me or Elowin tonight. Where are you going? To find Marcus Prether. She said it flatly, without fanfare, and Hester stared at her with something in her expression that Tamsin didn't have time to interpret. Outside, Elowin fell into step beside her. Marcus Prether, Elowin said. The Prether baby might not survive another cold night, Tamsin said. That's the most urgent thing. He told you to sit down. In front of the whole settlement. I know what he did, and you're going to help him first. I'm going to help the baby first, Tamsin said. Marcus Prether is incidental to that calculation. The baby is not. Elowin walked beside her in silence for a moment. You are a strange woman, she said finally. Not unkindly. People keep telling me that, Tamsin said. The Prether cabin was 7 minutes away across packed snow and 2 narrow paths between other cabins that had the unnervingly empty feel of a settlement where people were staying inside. She saw one face at a window, someone who pulled back immediately when they saw her, kept walking. Marcus Prether opened the door before she knocked. He'd heard the footsteps, probably. He was a large man. She'd always noticed that about him. The way he filled doorways, and in the cold morning light, he looked wrong. Not physically diminished, exactly, but something in his face had been rearranged since the last time she'd seen it. The certainty was gone. In its place was something rawer and less organized. He looked at her. She looked at him. How's the baby? Tamsin said. Whatever he'd prepared himself to say, and she could see that he'd prepared something, it wasn't that. His mouth opened slightly and then closed. How's the baby? She said again. Not a question this time. Cold, he said. His voice was wrecked in a different way from Elowin's. Dorothy, she's keeping the baby against her body to share heat. We burned the last of the wood this morning. Let me in, Tamsin said. Step back. Dorothy Prether was sitting on the bed with the newborn pressed against her chest under 2 blankets, her arms wrapped around the bundle in the particular rigid way of someone who has been holding the same position for so long that their muscles have stopped registering the effort. She looked up when Tamsin came in. She didn't speak. She watched Tamsin cross the room and set down her pack and start building a fire in their hearth with the last of the wood she'd brought, and she watched it catch. And when the warmth started reaching her, she closed her eyes and her whole body seemed to settle slightly, like something that had been braced for a long time, finally allowing itself to release a fraction. Tamsin built the fire and then pulled the remaining food from her pack. There wasn't much, but there was enough for a day's worth of real eating for both of them, and she set it on the table. Then she turned to Marcus. He was standing in the middle of the room, looking at her, and his face was doing the thing that faces do when what's happening doesn't fit inside the framework of understanding that someone has been operating with. I told you to sit down, he said. He said it like a confession. You did, Tamsin said. I voted to drive you out. I know. And He couldn't finish it. Bring your children, Tamsin said. She had made the toes were dark. She had made a decision on the walk over one she hadn't fully articulated to herself until the moment she opened her mouth to say it. All of you. Get what you can carry. Food, blankets, your warmest clothing. Marcus stared at her. Where are we going? I have somewhere warm, she said. Proper shelter. Food. A fire that doesn't go out. She watched his face while she said it not to enjoy the disbelief, but because she needed to see if he trusted her enough to follow, and she needed to know quickly. Bring your family. He looked at Dorothy. Dorothy was already moving, pulling the baby in tighter and starting to stand. Elowin came through the door behind Tamsin. We need to move faster than we planned, she said, low and close to Tamsin's ear. Wade Coulter was at the end of the path when we came in. He saw us. Garrick would know she was here within the hour. Possibly sooner, Tamsin recalculated. The Hendress needed to come now. The Vermers and the Rosens and whoever else was going cold, she needed to move through this settlement faster than she'd planned, and she needed to do it before Garrick could organize a response. How many families are in real trouble? She asked Elowen. Right now, today, who cannot stay in their cabins safely? Elowen thought. 6 families, maybe 15 to 20 people, counting children. Cave could hold 15 to 20 people if it had to. It was going to have to. She turned to Marcus. Get your family ready to move. I'll be back for you in 20 minutes. Don't open the door for anyone except me. She went back out into the cold. The next 2 hours were the hardest sustained effort of her entire life, and that was saying something given the past several weeks. She moved through the settlement in a pattern she'd worked out. As she went, not the center first, not anywhere near Garrick's property, but the outlying cabins where the most vulnerable families were and where Garrick's visibility was lowest. She went to the Hendry cabin and told them to pack and be ready. She found the Rosens' 2 cabins, east husband-wife, 3 children. The youngest with a cough she assessed quickly and decided was cold-related rather than illness-related, and gave them the same message. She found the Vermeers, who were an elderly couple of very few words, who listened to her explain the situation, and then began packing without asking a single question, which she found unexpectedly moving. Every cabin the same thing. People who had watched her walk out of this settlement in the snow. People who had said nothing. People whose silence had been its own kind of vote. She didn't make them apologize. She didn't ask for explanations. She knocked on the door and told them she had somewhere safe and warm, and that they should come now and bring their children. And she watched their faces move through the same sequence, the shock of seeing her, the confused recalibration. Most of its windows were dark, the moment when the weight of the child in their arms or the empty hearth behind them became more immediate than any of the rest of it came. Marcus Prether fell into step with her after the 3rd cabin, carrying his youngest wrapped against his chest, Dorothy, beside him, and the 2 older children following. He didn't ask what she needed. He just started out helping, going to the doors she pointed at, knocking, explaining in his big, direct voice that Tamsin Aldridge had somewhere safe and warm, and they needed to go now. Tamsin's noticed this, didn't comment on it, just adjusted her route to account for the additional voice and kept moving. She was at the Hollis cabin the family Hester had mentioned, with the private woodlot, trying to negotiate a supply of wood they could carry, when she heard Garrick's voice behind her. She turned around. He was 40 feet away, coming up the path between cabins with Wade Coulter on one side and one of the Birch brothers on the other. He looked at her the way you look at something you've categorized once and are surprised to find still existing in a category you thought was closed. Tamsin Aldridge, he said. Something in his voice tried to land on authority and got most of the way there. Around her, the families she'd gathered, they'd been moving, organized, shifting in the direction of the settlement's northeast edge, went still. She felt it rather than saw it. The way a group of people who've been moving with purpose goes collective still when they perceive a threat. She turned to face Garrick fully. He looked at the group behind her. He counted, probably. He did the same recalculation she'd done an hour ago, and she could see him doing it in his face, and she could see the moment he decided that the direct authority approach was still the one that would work. You were removed from this settlement, he said, for the community's safety. I removed myself from this conversation, Tamsin said. Now I'm back in it. What I'm doing, she said, is taking people to shelter. You can follow us or you can stay here. Those are your options. A sound from the group behind her. Not quite a collective noise, more like the communal shift of people who've just processed that someone said something clearly and without apology. Garrick's jaw tightened. These people's allocations. Stop saying that word, Tamsin said. Allocation. Like you're doing them a favor with things that belong to them. Like they should be grateful to get back a portion of what's theirs. She looked at him steadily. Wade Birch. She looked at the 2 men flanking him. I know you've been eating better than your neighbors. For the past month. That's done now. Come with us or stay. But understand that whatever leverage you thought you had is gone, because I'm taking these families somewhere Garrick Gacvain has no say over. And come spring, they'll remember exactly who helped them and who didn't. Wade Coulter looked at Garrick. Then he looked at the group of families standing in the snow. Then he looked at something in the middle distance that probably wasn't anything in particular. Birch, Garrick said, a warning in it. The Birch brother didn't move. Not toward Garrick. Not toward Tamsin. He just stood there. Garrick looked back at Tamsin. You'll be back by spring, and this settlement will have an order to it that. Come on, Tamsin said to the families behind her. Not to Garrick. To the people who were waiting. She turned her back on Garrick Vane and started walking, and she listened very carefully to what happened next. What happened next was footsteps. Multiple sets, in the packed snow, moving in the direction she was moving. She didn't look back. Garrick said something. She didn't catch all of it. She didn't try to. The footsteps kept coming. The walk back to the cave was the most difficult logistical challenge she'd navigated since the original journey out. She had close to 18 people moving through difficult terrain, people in various states of cold and exhaustion, with children of various ages, with varying degrees of physical capability. The Vermeers were slow. One of the Rosen children was frightened and crying in a sustained, exhausted that she couldn't fix, but had to keep moving around. Dorothy Prether was carrying the newborn and managing the terrain with a focused intensity that Tamsin recognized as the kind that doesn't allow for stumbling, because stumbling isn't an option. Marcus Prether moved up and down the line, helping where help was needed, his large presence useful in ways that had nothing to do with leadership and everything to do with simple physical capability. He got the Vermeers across the difficult section near the tree line without anyone asking him to. He carried the Rosen child, who was too exhausted to walk the last half mile, while their mother stayed close. Elowen moved alongside Tamsin at the front, guiding, setting the pace, communicating to the line behind them when to slow down and when to speed up. She did it without drama and without seeking acknowledgement, which Tamsin noticed in the precise way she noticed everything useful. The cave came into view in the early afternoon. The entrance, half cleared from the storm drift she'd dug out to rescue Elowen, looked small from a distance. Small enough that several people in the line made sounds that suggested doubt about what they were walking toward. Tamsin stopped at the entrance and turned around. Behind her, in a rough and exhausted line across the snow, stood the people of Redwillow Crossing. Children, parents, elderly, people who'd looked away, people who'd voted, people who'd called it a community decision and gone home and locked their doors. Standing outside a mountain, following a woman they'd driven out of their settlement into the coldest winter set in recent memory. It's warmer inside than it looks from out here, she said. You'll need to angle your shoulders to get through the entrance. There's more room once you're past it. She turned and went in first. Brenda was waiting just inside the outer cave section, which meant she'd heard the group coming from some distance and had already started stoking the fire to its highest reasonable output. She looked past Tamsin at the faces beginning to appear in the entrance one by one, people ducking through and then straightening up and looking around, and her expression was controlled in the way that meant she was feeling something she wasn't going to perform in public. The children came through and stopped. They stopped the way children stop when something doesn't match what they expected. The interior of the shelter, the reed walls, the stone floor, the hide lining, the fire burning clean beneath the chimney fissure, stored food and organized supplies, and the sleeping area with its careful arrangement was not what they'd imagined a cave would look like. It was warm. It smelled of wood smoke and pine, and something herbal from the medicinal plants Tamsin had stored. The youngest, Hendry child, the 4-year-old, walked directly to the fire and held out her hands the same way she had in her own cabin that morning. Slowly, the rest of the settlement followed her in. They stood in the warmth and looked at what Tamsin Aldridge had made out of nothing, out of frozen wilderness and stone and reed, and her own exhausted body, and her refusal to stop, and the various sounds that people make when they realize they have been comprehensively wrong about something began to move through the group in different ways. Some people were very quiet. Some had to look away. Marcus Prether stood in the center of the shelter with his newborn daughter pressed against his chest, and he looked at the walls and the floor and the hearth, and then he looked at Tamsin. His face was not doing any of the things she'd seen it do before. Not the dismissiveness, not the performative authority. It was doing something much simpler and less protected, and she couldn't look at it for very long. All right, she said to the room, because there were things to organize and people to feed. and children to settle before the light outside got any weaker. Firewood needs to be collected before dark. I'll show you where to find it and how to haul it. The sleeping area can be expanded if we add more insulation to the outer section. I'll show you how to do that too. Food is here, we'll portion it out evenly. Everybody works. Everybody eats. That's how this functions. She looked around the room. Nobody argued. Nobody told her to sit down. She picked up her coat and went back out into the cold, and after a moment, without being told twice, people began following her. The first night, with 18 people in the cave, was nothing like the quiet Tamsin had grown used to. It wasn't bad. It was just loud in the way that living things are loud when they've been afraid for a long time and suddenly find themselves somewhere warmer than they expected. Children cried and then stopped crying. Adults talked in the low murmur of people processing something they hadn't finished understanding yet. The Vermeers sat close together near the fire and said almost nothing, but old Vermeer kept putting his hand on his wife's hand, and she kept letting him, which was its own kind of conversation. Dorothy Prether found a corner of the sleeping area where the wall met the stone and pressed her back into it and held the baby against her chest with the particular stillness of a woman who has decided that this spot is safe, and she is not moving from it until morning. Tamsin moved through all of it, assigning sleeping spaces systematically without sentiment, putting the smallest children and the elderly closest to the fire, and the adults who could generate their own warmth further out, showing people the wood storage and explaining the burn rate, how much to add, and why you built the fire a particular way under the chimney fissure, why you didn't pile it higher just because the fuel was available. 3 of the fathers listened with the focused attention of men who understood they were being given information they needed and were not too proud to receive it. One of them, Jonas Rosen, a thin, quiet man she'd barely spoken to in all her years at Redwillow Crossing, asked 2 careful questions that told her he was already thinking about how to replicate the technique. She answered both questions fully. No withholding. No calculated advantage in keeping knowledge to herself. That had never been her approach, and it wasn't going to start being her approach now. Brenna moved through the space, doing what Brenna did, quiet organization. The kind that doesn't announce itself but results in things being findable and functional. She got the food distributed in the equitable portions Tamsin had outlined, talking to each family individually as she did it, saying it's enough to be human about it, and not so much that it became something people had to respond to when they were exhausted. She found the youngest, Henry child, asleep near the fire before anyone had thought to move her, and relocated her to the sleeping area with the practiced ease of someone who had handled sleeping children in her time. Elowen helped without being directed. That was the thing Tamsin noticed.
Jesus.
In the settlement, in the life before this winter, Elowen had been the kind of person who needed the shape of a situation to be established before she knew where to position herself in it. Out here, that quality had been burned off by necessity and cold, and the particular experience of almost dying in the snow outside someone's door. She moved through the cave with a directness that suited her face better than the careful social navigation Tamsin remembered. They didn't talk about the future that first night. There wasn't room for it. The present was consuming everything available. What Tamsin noticed, lying awake in the dark long after most people had found some version of sleep, was the sound of the shelter breathing. Not metaphorically, literally, the way a space changes its acoustic quality when it's full of living bodies. The fire's small sounds, someone's child murmuring in sleep, the Rosen baby making the soft irregular sounds of newborn sleep. Stone and reed walls doing the work she'd built them to do, holding warmth against the winter outside, was still very much present and not interested in anyone's situation. She thought about the walk back to Redwillow Crossing that morning. About Garrick's face when he saw how many people were already behind her. About the calculation she'd watched him make, and the moment the calculation came up wrong for him. About Wade Coulter not moving when Garrick said his name. She didn't feel triumphant about any of it. Triumph implied that something was finished and nothing was finished. Garrick was still into Redwillow Crossing. The communal grain and firewood were still locked behind his implicit authority. There were people in the settlement she hadn't reached, families who'd been closer to Garrick's inner circle, or simply too far across the settlement for her to get to in the time she'd had. The situation was better than it had been yesterday morning. It was not resolved. She turned over on the stone floor, adjusted the blanket, and calculated what tomorrow needed to look like. Morning in the cave with 18 people in it was a different operation from morning alone with Brenna. Fire needed to be larger to heat the expanded space adequately, which meant the wood supply she'd accumulated needed to be replenished faster than she'd planned for. She had people now to do the replenishing, which was the whole point, but they needed to be organized to do it effectively and not simply sent into the wilderness to figure it out independently. She was up before most of them. She and Brenna put water on to heat. They'd need more clay vessels. That was immediately apparent. A problem she filed for later, and Tamsin stood at the cave entrance in the pre-dawn dark and looked at the landscape and ran through what she knew. The immediate needs, in order: water, firewood, food. The same order she'd maintained since the night she'd arrived here with Brenna and nothing else. The difference now, was that she had people to distribute the work to, which meant more could be done in parallel, which meant things could improve faster. She organized the firewood teams first. Marcus Prether and Jonas Rosen, who'd asked the smart questions the night before. She gave the route to the best deadwood sections and the sled technique she'd developed, and she watched them look at the improvised sled with the same mix of skepticism, and immediate understanding she'd felt the first time she thought of it herself. They left before full light, with 3 of the older children who were capable of hauling without getting lost. Creek was the other priority. She'd been going alone. Now she sent 2 people to Hollis' husband, who turned out to have done some fishing, and his teenage son with the most functional of her improvised fishing rigs and directions to the spot she'd found most productive, with instructions about testing the ice before stepping on it and specific of its tannins near the eastern bank that she'd broken through twice. She watched them go and felt the odd, slightly unmooring sensation of having distributed the survival work outward. For weeks, she'd carried the weight of every decision and every task inside her own body. Now it was moving outward, being held by other people, which was correct and necessary, and also required a specific kind of trust she had to consciously extend rather than have come naturally. Brenna peered beside her. "You're watching them like they might dissolve." "I'm watching them to see if I explained it clearly enough. They're adults. They'll manage. The creek ice. Tamsin." Her mother's voice, that particular register. "Let them go." She turned from the entrance. The morning unfolded in a way she hadn't fully planned, but should have anticipated. When you put human beings together in a survival situation and give them clear roles, most of them are capable of more than they've been allowed to demonstrate. The firewood teams returned with more than she'd sent them for, because Marcus had found a section of fallen dead timber she hadn't discovered in her own ranging. The Hollis father and son came back with 7 fish, which was better than she'd done alone. 3 of the women asked to see the snare placements, and she walked them out and showed them. And within an hour, one of them had found 3 better locations for snares than the ones she'd been using, based on track patterns in the snow that she'd missed. This was the part that surprised her. Not that they were capable, she'd never believed they weren't. What surprised her was how quickly it happened, once the structure was there. Once someone said, "Here is what needs doing. Here is how it can be done. Everyone works and everyone eats." The weeks of its windows were dark. The weeks she'd spent alone building and maintaining everything by herself had been necessary, but they'd also been the hard version of what could be done. And she'd been doing it at the edge of her physical limits the whole time. With 18 people distributing the work, the load dropped to something genuinely manageable. Her knees noticed. They had a more moderate opinion about this arrangement than about the previous one. It was on the second day that someone came from the settlement. Not Garrick. One of the families she hadn't reached, the Cutler family, the husband arriving alone first, his face showing the signs of 2 days without adequate heat. He'd heard from someone who'd stayed behind that people had gone somewhere, and he'd followed the tracks in the snow. Tamsin let him in. That afternoon, his wife and their 3 children made the same walk. Over the next 4 days, in 1s and 2s and small family groups, people from Redwillow Crossing kept coming. Not all of them, there were families who stayed, either because they were genuinely aligned with Garrick, or because they were too proud or too afraid to follow a path that required them to acknowledge what had happened. But enough came that by the end of the first week, the cave and its immediate surroundings were holding something that functioned less like a refugee camp and more like a small, rough community. She expanded the shelter twice during that period. Both times it was a communal effort. She showed people the technique, the materials, the reasoning behind the construction choices, and they did it alongside her with varying degrees of skill and comparable levels of determination. The second expansion involved reinforcing the outer cave section as a working and storage area, which required moving more stone than she could have managed alone and would have taken her a week to do solo. It took one afternoon with 10 people. She kept building in her mind even as they built with their hands, kept cataloging what worked and what needed adjustment. The chimney fissure was adequate for the original fire, but with a larger fire it needed widening. She spent an afternoon with a pointed stone tool working at the crack's edges, and a man named Tullis, who turned out to have been a stonemason's apprentice in his previous life before the frontier took over, showed her a more efficient technique for working sedimentary stone that she would not have discovered on her own. She learned things from all of them. That was the part that would stay with her longest. Jonas Rosen knew a method for preserving fish in cold conditions that extended their storage life significantly. Old Vermeer knew which tree barks were edible in extremity and which varieties were in the forest nearby. The Hollis wife had knowledge of plant-based materials for weaving that was more extensive than Tamsin's and resulted in denser, warmer reed panels when applied. A teenage girl named Suki Cutler, who barely spoke and seemed to observe everything, turned out to have a spatial instinct for shelter design that she demonstrated by pointing out, on the third day, that the prevailing wind direction relative to the cave entrance could be exploited to create a natural air channeling effect that would improve the chimney draft without any structural changes. She was 15 years old, and she was right. Tamsin looked at this girl and thought about all the things that settlement life had probably never given her room to demonstrate. Orson Pike appeared on the fourth day. He came out of the trees and stopped at the edge of the expanded activity around the cave entrance, the firewood hauling, the fishing gear being repaired, the sounds of that many people occupying that much space, and his expression moved through several things before settling on something she couldn't quite read. She went to him. "You have company," he said. "I have a settlement," she said. He looked at her. "How?" "The same way I built the shelter," she said. "One piece at a time, and I didn't stop." He was quiet for a moment. He had a bundle less this time, she thought, which probably meant his own supplies were lower than he'd been letting on. She'd think about that. "You're staying," he said. "Not a question. Out here?" "For the rest of winter, yes. The settlement's not safe to go back to while Garrick holds the supplies." "And after winter?" "After winter," she said, "things are going to be different." He considered this with the particular deliberation of someone who has lived long enough to be skeptical of that sentence, but can see, in this specific case, the evidence behind. "I'll bring what I can spare," he said. "I know you will," she said. "Orson." She waited until he looked at her directly. "You don't have to keep doing it alone out here. There's a place by the fire if you want it." He didn't answer right away. He looked at the cave entrance, at the activity around it, at the smoke rising cleanly from somewhere inside. "Maybe," he said. It was a different maybe than the one she'd heard from him before. It had something softer in it. She didn't push. She went back to work. The question of Garrick came to a head, as she'd known it would, on the 9th day. He came himself, which surprised her slightly. She'd expected Wade Coulter or the Birch brothers as an opening move, some representative she could deal with at a remove. Instead, Garrick Vane walked up the path through the trees with 2 men behind him and stopped 20 feet from the cave entrance, where Tamsin was working on the exterior storage expansion with Marcus Prether and Jonas Rosen. The 3 of them stopped what they were doing. Garrick looked at the exterior modifications, at the smoke, at the evidence of sustained occupation. He was wearing his better coat, the one with the fur collar that he wore to community gatherings, to signal status. It looked strange in the wilderness context in a way she suspected he wasn't aware of. "I'd like to speak with you," he said. His voice had the formal quality he deployed when he wanted to project authority without explicitly claiming it. "You're speaking with me now," Tamsin said. He glanced at Marcus and Jonas, privately. "No," she said, a pause. He hadn't expected that, or he'd expected it, but not so flat. "Tamsin," he said, shifting register, going for something more reasonable. "What's happened here has been there. Have been misunderstandings. On both sides. The settlement is struggling without the families who've come here. and I think a conversation about. There weren't misunderstandings, she said. You stood on my porch and told me to leave. You called me a threat to the community in front of everyone. You took my land. Those aren't misunderstandings. He pressed on. The communal resources, the grain, the firewood, those need to be redistributed fairly, I understand that. I'm willing to discuss how that happens. You're willing to discuss it, she said. Yes. Because most of your settlement is currently living in a cave on a hill, and the ones who aren't are starting to ask questions you don't have good answers to. Something moved across his face. Not shame, she didn't think Garrick Vane had that particular response available to him. Sectitsis. Something more like the recalibration of someone who has realized that the leverage they came here with isn't landing the way they planned. Behind her, she was aware that people had come to the cave entrance. Not crowding, just present. The way people become present when something significant is happening. She didn't look back. What do you want? Garrick asked. It was the right question. She'd been waiting for it because she'd thought carefully about the answer. The grain and firewood are redistributed immediately, she said. Equally. No allocations, no administration, no you deciding who gets what. Goes back to the communal system that existed before you took it over. He started to say something. I'm not finished, she said. My land reverts to me with the deed recorded in the settlement's own record with 3 witnesses. The document you had drawn up claiming administrative authority is burned publicly in front of everyone who signed it, and you don't participate in settlement governance in any formal capacity for a period of 2 years. 2 men behind him exchanged a look. Those terms are, Garrick began. Those are the terms, Tamsin said. The alternative is that spring comes. These families go back to their cabins, and every one of them testifies in front of whatever outside authority eventually establishes jurisdiction over this territory about exactly what happened here this winter. You will not come out of that well. The silence that followed had a specific quality. She'd learned to read the silences in rooms in this case, an outdoor space in snow, the way she read skies and soil. This one had the texture of something giving way. 2 years, Garrick said. 2 years. He looked at her, and for a brief, strange moment, she saw something in his face that wasn't calculation or anger or wounded authority. Something that looks almost like curiosity, the same way a person might look at something they underestimated and is now reassessing at its actual size. You came back, he said. You could have stayed out here until spring and been safe. I know, she said. Why? She thought about the 4-year-old Hendry child holding her hands toward the fire. The newborn Prether daughter pressed against Dorothy's chest in a cabin with no heat. Old Vermeer's hand on his wife's hand in the dark. Because I can't not, she said. That's just what I am. He considered this for a long moment. Then he said, send someone to the settlement tomorrow morning. We'll do it your way. He turned and walked back through the trees with his 2 men, and Tamsin watched him go, and she didn't feel what she thought she might feel. She didn't feel victorious. She felt tired and correct and slightly unreal, the way you feel when something you've been working toward for a long time actually arrives, and your body hasn't caught up with the fact that you can stop pushing. Marcus Prether moved up beside her. He stood there for a moment. 2 years, he said. It should probably be longer, she said. But I'm not interested in punishment. I'm interested in not having it happen again. He nodded slowly. When we go back. I'm going to need people to think about what went wrong, she said. Not just Garrick. What in the settlement structure made it possible for one person to do what he did? Because he didn't create the problem, he used a problem that already existed. Marcus was quiet. That's the harder conversation, she said. And we're going to have it. He didn't argue with her. He went back to the storage expansion, picked up the piece of timber he'd set down, and kept working. The redistribution happened the way she'd specified 2 days later. She went back to Redwillow Crossing with Elowen and Marcus and Jonas Rosen, and they opened the storage building and began moving the grain and the wood back into a communal system. Garrick was not present. For most of it, he'd retreated into his property and didn't appear. Wade Coulter showed up partway through the morning, stood at the edge of the activity for a while, and eventually picked up one end of a grain sack when nobody was watching him too directly. The settlement families who'd remained came out of their cabins and watched. Some helped. The ones who'd been receiving better allocations were quiet and kept their eyes down. She didn't address them specifically. What they'd done was less than what Garrick had done, and more than nothing, and the accounting for it would happen in the slow, complicated way that community accounting always happens, through time and what people chose to do next. Her land deed was signed by 4 witnesses, not 3. She hadn't asked for the additional witness. Jonas Rosen had simply added himself to the signatures without comment, as if the number mattered, and 3 wasn't enough. Garrick's administrative document was burned in the center of the settlement, in front of 14 people. He wasn't among them. She noticed this and decided it was irrelevant. The document was gone. What it had represented was gone with it. She stood and watched the paper burn, and felt something in her chest that she spent a moment identifying. Not closure, that word was too clean, too sealed. Something more like the end of a particular effort, the way your body feels when you've been holding something heavy for a long time and you finally set it down, still changed by the holding, still aware of what it cost. The thing was down. They moved back to the settlement in stages over the following week as the weather moderated slightly and the families judged their cabins warm enough to return to with the now properly distributed firewood. Tamsin and Brenna were among the last to go back, partly because there were things to complete and partly because she found, unexpectedly, that leaving was harder than she'd anticipated. She stood in the shelter on the last morning, the reed walls, the stone floor, the hearth that had burned for weeks without going dark, and she looked at what she'd built and felt the particular tenderness of someone leaving something they made with their hands. "We can come back," Brenna said. She was standing in the entrance, her pack on, practical as always. "I know," Tamsin said. "It'll still be here." "I know that, too." She pressed her palm flat against the closest wall section, the reed and clay panel she'd built in the first days, before she had any help, when the winter had felt like something personal and relentless. The wall was solid, dry, warmer to the touch than stone had any right to be. "I want to make sure it stays available," she said. "Not just for us, for anyone who needs it. I want to put it in the settlement's record, the location, the construction, the how of it, so it's not lost." "Write it down then," Brenna said. "You've always been better at recording things than Callan was anyway." Tamsin laughed once, the short, genuine kind. "That's true." She banked the fire. She left it low and stable, the way she'd learned to leave it when she was going out for the day and coming back. The way you leave something you intend to return to. They walked out into the late winter morning, the air still cold, but with the quality change that came in late February when the season began to consider the possibility of something else. The sky was the pale blue of winter losing its conviction. The snow was still deep, but the surface was crystalline and reflective rather than the heavy matte of the coldest months. She stopped once and looked back at the hillside. The cave entrance, narrow in the rock face, the pines around it, unchanged by everything that had happened inside and around them. From out here, you wouldn't know what was in there. You'd walk past it and see a hill. She knew what was in there. She turned and kept walking. The return to Redwillow Crossing was not a ceremony. She'd half expected it to feel like one and had been braced for that to be uncomfortable. Instead, it was simply practical people moving back to their homes, the settlements that's resuming the settlements with the logistic of daily life, with the adjusted resource distribution and the knowledge that winter had a definite end coming that it hadn't seemed to have before. The public accounting happened gradually, in the way public accountings usually happen in small communities, not in a single dramatic meeting, but in dozens of smaller moments over the following days. Elowyn spoke first, at one of the community gatherings, and her testimony about what Garrick had engineered and what she'd witnessed was clear and specific and cost her something to say, which gave it weight. Prethers spoke. The Hendra spoke. Old Vermeer said 3 sentences in his quiet, finalistic way that somehow contained everything. Marcus Prether was the one who said the thing that nobody else quite managed to say directly. He stood up at the gathering and looked at the assembled settlement and said, "I told Tamsin Aldridge to sit down. I said it out loud, in front of all of you, I believed. I was right to say it." A pause. "My youngest daughter is alive because of the woman I said that to. I want that recorded. Not because I want to be punished for it, because if we don't say what actually happened, it'll happen again." Nobody made noise after that. The room sat with it. Tamsin, sitting near the back, did not stand up, did not say anything. She let it be what it was. Garrick Vane was absent from the gathering. He'd been absent from most communal activity since the day she'd stood in front of his storage building and told him how it was going to go. He still lived in Redwillow Crossing in his own property, not hers, which she was back in by then, sleeping in the house Callan had built and finding, strangely, that it felt simultaneously familiar and completely different. She moved through it differently than she had before winter. She wasn't sure yet what that meant. Garrick didn't come to her land. He didn't speak to her or send anyone to speak to her. He existed in the settlement the way certain rocks exist in a landscape present, unmovable by ordinary effort, eventually something that people work around rather than try to address directly. She kept the 2-year term in the settlement record, witnessed and signed, and she didn't spend energy worrying about him. He had lost the thing that had made him dangerous, which was other people's willingness to follow him, and without that he was simply a man with property and a certain kind of face who had done something terrible and been stopped. She spent the first weeks of her return doing what she'd told Marcus she'd do, thinking carefully about what structural failures had made Garrick possible. She didn't do this alone. She had the conversations she'd told Marcus they needed to have in her kitchen, in the settlement's gathering space, in the small groups that formed naturally when the weather kept people close. She asked questions more than she made statements. Why did we keep communal resources in a system that allowed one person to control them? What was the decision-making process that led a vote like the one that drove me out pass without proper challenge? What would have changed if there had been an alternative authority structure? The answers were uncomfortable and unsimple, and she didn't rush them toward resolution. What she was building now was different from the cave shelter, but required the same fundamental approach, one structural element at a time, understanding what you were trying to protect before deciding how to protect it, making sure what you built could hold the weight of actual use and not just the weight of an ideal. The winter stores were the first thing she changed. Shared grain was moved to a system with 3 key holders. No single person could access it without 2 others present. She proposed this not as a rule imposed from authority, but as a question: what system would prevent what happened? The settlement worked it out together and arrived at something like this on their own, which mattered more than any solution she could have handed them. The firewood became a managed commons with regular, visible accounting quantities recorded, distribution public, anyone in the settlement able to verify the numbers at any time. Simple. The simplicity was the point. Opacity was the thing Garrick had exploited. She proposed the emergency shelter registration, putting the cave location, construction method, and maintenance responsibility into the settlement's official record. This sparked a longer conversation about what other emergency resources existed or should exist. And that conversation was still going on productively when spring arrived, which she considered the correct outcome. Conversations that were dark. Conversations that were still going were not conversations that had been closed off by someone since deciding they knew the answer. Spring arrived the way it does at the frontier, not as a release, but as a negotiation. Warmer days interrupted by cold ones. Snow receding and then returning reduced but still present. The mud season, which was its own particular misery of a different kind. Planted. She'd lost the winter crops. Callan had planned those were gone with the season, grown in someone else's field under someone else's management, and she didn't know what Garrick had done with them or whether they'd succeeded. She started from what she had, her own seed stores, the soil she knew, the understanding of her land's particular character that she'd built over years of working alongside Callan and then alone. The first time she knelt in spring thaw and pressed her fingers into the soil, she felt the strange dual awareness she'd been living with since winter, the person she was before the expulsion, who had worked this ground as Callan's wife and then as his widow, and the person she was now, who had built a home out of a mountain and navigated a winter that had broken other things and not broken her. Both of those people were in her hands in the soil. She couldn't separate them. She didn't try. Orson Pike came to the settlement once. She'd half expected it wouldn't happen at all, and she wasn't going to push him toward it. But on a morning in early April, she looked up from the field, and he was standing at the edge of it, looking at the turned earth, with an expression she recognized as the specific expression of someone who loves soil. "Good drainage here," he said. "I know," she said. Callan picked the plot for it. He walked out to where she was and stood beside her and looked at the field. He'd left his pack somewhere, not carrying it, which was the first time she'd seen him without it. "There's a room," she said, "if you're interested, in the settlement. Nothing large, but warm." He looked at the field for another moment. "The cave's going to need maintenance," he said. "Winter damage. The east wall section." "I know," she said. "I was going to go up in a few weeks. I'll take a look before then," he said. "Make sure the structure is sound." She looked at him. "I'll need somewhere to stay after," he said, "while I assess it." "There's a room," she said again. He nodded once, in the way that with Orson Pike meant yes. Elowyn was harder. The forgiveness, if it could be called that, which Tamsin wasn't entirely sure it could, was not the sudden, clean thing that stories liked to make it. It was more like the spring itself, gradual, interrupted, moving forward by degrees with cold reversals. Some days it was easy to be with Elowyn, and other days it was not. And the not easy days were honest days, too, and she tried to allow both without deciding that one or the other represented the truth of how things stood. What she knew was that Elowyn showed up. That was the foundation of whatever they were rebuilding. When there was work to do, Elowyn was there to do it. When Tamsin needed someone to be in the field beside her, while she worked through a problem, she was thinking out loud. Elowyn stood in the field. When Brenna had a difficult week in April, her body reasserting the toll the winter had taken in the subtler way of old bodies, with fatigue and a persistent joint stiffness that was new, Elowyn came without being asked and sat with her and did not treat her like someone who was diminished. Forgiveness, Tamsin had decided, was not a feeling you arrived at. It was a practice you chose and repeated until the repetition built something that functioned like ground. Brenna recovered. Slowly and with the particular stubbornness of someone who considers frailty an imposition, she got her strength back in the longer days and the better food, and the particular tonic Tamsin made from the medicinal plants she'd been growing since early spring. By May she was in the garden, with her hands in the dirt, and an opinion about where the root vegetables should be placed that differed from Tamsin's, and was probably correct. Tamsin kept her land. She kept it and worked it, and it was hers in the full, simple sense that it had always been the ground. Callan had loved the well he dug, the fields she'd learned on his shoulder, and then learned again on her own. She did not have to fight for it a second time. The deed was signed and recorded and witnessed, and it sat in the settlement's registry. And she did not look at it often, but she knew it was there. What she thought about, in the longer spring evenings when the light held longer, and there was a moment between the work's end and sleep's beginning, what she actually thought about was not the cave, or Garrick, or the vote, or any of the dramatic chapters of the previous months. What she thought about most was something smaller. She thought about the moment she'd crouched in the dark of the cave on the first night and pressed her palm against the stone wall and understood that it was solid and dry, and that the wind could not reach them inside it, before she'd built anything, before she'd solved any of the larger problems. Just that first moment of understanding that the structure around her was sound and that she and her mother were alive. She thought about how much had come from that single unglamorous fact. The wall was solid. Not victory, just solid. Not transformation, just something real that could hold them. She had not become someone else through the winter. That was the thing she wanted people to understand. If she'd had the kind of authority to stand up and say things people listened to, which she now had, she recognized that, and it sat on her with more weight than she'd expected, and she was trying to hold it the right way. She had not emerged thinner or sharper edged or somehow reformed by suffering into a more acceptable version of herself. She was the same very large young widow who had been shoved off her own porch and driven into the snow. She still had the knees. She still moved through certain terrain at her own pace, and not at the other people thought she should be moving at. She still occupied the same body that Garrick Vane had gestured to as evidence of her inadequacy. That body had built a home inside a mountain. That body had walked through a 4-day blizzard's aftermath and knocked on cabin doors and told freezing families to follow her. That body had stood in front of Garrick Vane 20 feet from her own cave entrance and named her terms and watched him take them. The body was the same. What was different was what she knew it had done, and what she knew it could do, and what she had stopped, waiting for permission from anyone else to claim as true. On a morning in late May, the settlement held a community gathering. Not the formal, procedural kind, just the regular gathering they'd been holding weekly since the Sioux decision structure was established. She sat in her usual spot, not at the front, not presiding, just present, like anyone else present. At the end of the meeting, someone Suki Cutler, the 15-year-old who understood spatial design and had barely spoken in public before, raised her hand and asked whether anyone had thought about what they'd do if a second person in the settlement needed to be removed from their position of power, what the process would look like, whether they'd thought that through. The room considered this question seriously. The room began to answer it. Tamsin listened, and she thought about a girl who noticed wind directions and knew where to channel heat, and who had learned, in a winter's worth of watching, that her observations were the kind that mattered. She made a note to talk to Suki after the meeting, about soil drainage, about shelter design, about the creek northeast of the hillside and the fish in it, and the particular way a mountain could hold warmth if you understood how to work with it, about all the things the land would tell you if you learned its language. That was how it began, she thought. Not with the big dramatic gestures, not with standing up to Garrick or rescuing families through the snow. Those things had happened, but they had come from something smaller and older, something Callan had pressed into her hand years before all of this, the willingness to look at what was actually in front of her and trust what she saw and not stop moving until she'd done what the situation required. She looked at the room full of people making decisions together imperfectly noisily, without anyone owning the outcome. And she thought, this is the thing worth building. Not the walls. The walls were what kept them alive long enough to get here. This people who had been afraid and wrong and silent choosing now, in the specific aftermath of what fear and silence had cost them, to do it differently, this was what lasted. She stepped outside into the spring air. The sky was clear and blue and wide, in the way that frontier skies are wide, with no edge in sight in any direction. The fields were green at the edges where the new growth was starting. The well caught the morning light. Somewhere northeast, up on a hill, she knew by memory now in the specific way you know places that have mattered to you, a fire was banked low in a stone hearth, under a chimney fissure, waiting. She breathed the spring air and went back to work.